Chapter 3583. Half an hour later, Lisa walked in with another tray. Other than steak, there were cheeseburgers, ham, and sugar eggs. Lisa walked into the kitchen and told the chef, "I'm still hungry. Fry another steak for me." The chef stared at her in shock. It was as though she was a mutated monster. Yu couldn't eat meat, and the nutritious meals were all vegetarian. They couldn't eat any protein or fat, so it would be suspicious if Xianxia wanted to eat meat. Hence, Lisa braced herself and said that she wanted to eat. Alas, her appetite was pitifully small and was not even 1/6 of little Xianxia's. Hence, when she mentioned that she wanted to have another serving of steak, the chefs looked at her as if they had seen a ghost. "Last meal. There's no more," Lisa warned. Xianxia nodded like he was pounding garlic. He wolfed down the steak and digested the rest of the food. Only then did he feel a little full. He was so touched that he wanted to cry. Xianxia licked the black pepper sauce on his knife and fork, still craving for more. Lisa sized him up coldly. This guy didn't look like an aristocrat at all. Instead, he looked like a starving refugee. "The way you eat isn't elegant at all. Bad review." Xianxia's lips twitched. He retorted, "A full man doesn't know the suffering of a starving man. Try starving yourself." "How rare. You didn't even know how to do idioms and basic arithmetic in the past. It's been a while, but you've improved." Xianxia said indignantly, "Who says I don't know how to do arithmetic? Give me the questions and I'll show you." Lisa mocked. "Do you think I'm as childish as you?" I don't think you know how to do arithmetic either." Xianxia sized her up with contempt. "Do you know how to multiply 10 by 10? Lisa looked at him with even more contempt. She asked, "What's 15 multiplied by 78 and divided by 20? Xianxia was speechless. He was dumbfounded. This arithmetic problem wasn't something that could be solved with just fingers. The problem was that even though his arithmetic skills had improved, he still needed to use what Yu had taught him. He was far from being able to do mental arithmetic. "Can you do it?" 58, 5, idiot. Xianxia threw himself onto the bed, feeling wronged. Lisa took the tray away and said disdainfully, "Tell me, why are you and Yu twins? Why is Yu so smart and you so stupid?" After saying that, she walked away as light as a feather. Xianxia clenched his fists in anger. He glared at her back and gritted his teeth. How infuriating! He was actually despised. "Sleep." Xianxia lay on the bed, hugged the blanket, and closed his eyes angrily. However, Lisa's disdainful gaze kept flashing through his mind. "Idiot, idiot, idiot," the demonic voice kept repeating in his ears. Xianxia couldn't take it anymore. He sat up and threw the pillow on the floor. "You're the idiot. At the Mu residence." Xianxia finished preparing dinner. She walked to the bedroom and gently knocked on the door. "Yu." There was no response. Xianxia opened the bedroom door and saw Yu sitting on the bed, expressionlessly looking out the window. She said gently, "It's time for dinner." Yu didn't move. Even his breathing was so weak that it was almost inaudible. Chapter 3584. Seeing that he didn't respond, Xianxia walked into the room and closed the door slowly. She walked over to him quietly and squatted down in front of him. However, she saw that his eyes were as still as a pool of stagnant water. There was no sign of life. Xianxia's heart ached terribly. She couldn't help but lift her hand, wanting to caress his face. However, Yu narrowed his eyes and slapped her hand away in disgust. There was a loud slap. The back of her hand was slapped to the side by him. "There should be a limit to your wishful thinking." Yu glanced at her coldly. Wherever his gaze landed, it was as if frost had struck. Xianxia could only feel that pair of cold eyes landing on her face. Every inch of her skin was about to be frozen into ice. Every time she saw his cold expression, Xianxia's heart felt like it was being stabbed. How did he become like this? Xianxia bit her lip hard as tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. Because of his heartless words, her heart was extremely broken. "Why are you crying?" Yu said in annoyance, "You only know how to cry. Even if you want to cry, don't do it in front of me. It's an eyesore." As he said this, he stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. His voice was emotionless as he said, "It's time to stop acting." Yun Shirshi's heart ached as she said, "Yu, I don't know why you've become like this. But I'm your mommy." Yu. Yu closed his eyes. Finally, he turned around impatiently and said coldly, "Don't call me by that damn name again." Damn it. When Yun Shirshir heard this, she felt as if she had been hit hard. It was undoubtedly heart-wrenching. Yu, that was his name. He had said before that no matter what, he would never change his name or his surname. His surname was Yun, and his name was Tianyu. His surname was Yun, and his name was Yu. This was the name his mommy had given him, and he cherished it very much. But now, Yu was coldly saying that it was a damn name. Yun Shirshir felt as if a knife was being twisted in her heart. "Yaya." Outside the door, a childish voice suddenly sounded. Yun Shirshir looked up and saw that the door was suddenly opened from the outside. Mu Yaja was standing at the door, holding the pink little Yueyao in his arms. Gong Jie said softly beside him. Yueyao kept calling for her brother. Mu Yaja walked in with Yueyao in his arms. When the little Yueyao saw Yun Shirshir, she immediately opened her arms and babbled, asking for a hug. Yun Shirshir took Yueyao from Mu Yaja's arms. She gently held her little hand and kissed her forehead. She said to her, "Yes, brother is back. Brother is back." Yueyao followed her gaze and looked at the figure by the bed. Her gaze suddenly froze. Brother, her young and tender voice was filled with childishness. It was clear and melodious like a wind chime, tinkling and extremely pleasing to the ear. Yu looked back and saw the little fellow in Yun Shirshir's arms. Her skin was as white as snow, and her eyes were big and watery. Her eyelashes were long and curly. Even though she was only 2 years old, her eyebrows were already beginning to take shape. Her facial features were actually somewhat similar to his. He couldn't help but be stunned. Yueyao suddenly stretched out her little hand, raised a finger, and pointed at him. She looked up at Yun Shirshir and opened her little mouth. Brother. Yun Shirshir's eyes couldn't help but sting. She immediately said, Yes, it's brother. It's brother," she still remembered. Chapter 3585. When Yueyao saw Yun Shirshir's affirmation, she felt greatly encouraged. She was so excited that she babbled and struggled to get down. Yun Shirshir squatted down and placed her on the ground. Yueyao took a step forward and suddenly lost her balance. She fell hard on the ground. However, she didn't seem to feel pain. She clumsily stuck out her butt and got up from the ground. She opened her small hands and walked unsteadily towards Yu. She was wearing the squeaky shoes that Mu Yaja had bought. When she walked, every step she took would make a squeaking sound and shine. In the beginning, Yueyao didn't like to walk. She kept pestering Yun Shirshir to carry her. After Yun Shirshir was done carrying her, she would let Xiao Yichen carry her, followed by her daddy. When they went out, they would always carry her in their arms. Even when she was old enough to walk, she didn't like to jump around on the ground. She was extremely quiet. Hence, Mu Yaja bought many pairs of such shoes. The little girl found it extremely novel. Every time she took a step, she would squeak. Hence, she started to walk more diligently. Even though she wasn't walking very smoothly, it was considered very smooth. Little Yueyao walked to Yu Yu's side. Seeing that she was about to trip, she hugged Yu Yu's leg tightly and sat on the ground. She hugged Yu Yu like a lazy koala bear. She looked up and smiled foolishly at him. This smile was as if all 3,000 worlds were shining brightly. When she smiled, her 2 front teeth were as cute as a rabbit's. She was mischievous and cute. Yueyao squeaked, Brother. She spoke fluently and clearly. Yu Yu understood her immediately. He turned his face away awkwardly and didn't look at her. Seeing that Yu Yu was ignoring her, Yueyao couldn't help but feel aggrieved. She tugged at Yu Yu's trousers with her 2 little hands. She even wanted to climb up Yu Yu's trousers. She really looked like a koala bear. Just as Yun Shirshir revealed a gratified smile, she saw Yu take a step back and avoid Yueyao. Yueyao lost her balance and fell to the ground. She sat up and instantly felt unhappy. Her entire little face scrunched up as if she had suffered a great grievance. Brother, she felt so aggrieved that 2 silver beads appeared at the corners of her eyes. She pursed her lips but held it in. When Xianxia saw this, she immediately walked over and wanted to carry Yueyao. However, Yueyao pushed her away. Even though she was only 2 years old, she had inherited Mu Yaja's stubbornness and aloofness. She stubbornly refused to be carried by Xianxia. She stood up again and staggered towards Yuyu. Yuyu widened his eyes in surprise. However, he saw that she had already walked in front of him and was hugging him like a koala bear. Her eyes were full of attachment. "Brother?" Yueyao held back her tears stubbornly and refused to let go. She wanted him to carry her. Yuyu remained unmoved, but his eyes were flickering fiercely. He turned his face away and didn't look at her anymore. After a long silence, he said word by word, "I'm not your brother." Yueyao widened her eyes. Obviously, she didn't understand what he said. However, when she saw his resolute expression, she couldn't hold back her aggrieved emotions any longer. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "Boo-hoo!" Yueyao hugged his leg and cried pitifully. Chapter 3586. You used to like her a lot. You kept hugging her and teaching her how to call you brother. Now that she's learned it, you're ignoring her when she calls you that? Yueyao pouted pitifully. She cried as she said, "Brother is ignoring her. Brother is ignoring her." Yu turned around expressionlessly and said coldly, "I'm not interested in playing house with you. So get lost." Yu turned around coldly and sat back on the bed like an ice sculpture. Xianxia carried Yueyao, sighed, and left. The door closed softly. Yu looked back slightly and glanced at the door. His eyes were cold, but there was a flash of absent-mindedness in the depths of his eyes. Yueyao's teary eyes appeared in his mind and his thoughts became even more chaotic. He fell on the bed, covered himself with the blanket, and closed his eyes. Outside the door, Mu Yaja and Gong Jie looked at Xianxia's disappointed and gloomy face. They looked at each other. Gong Jie said, "Xia, don't worry. Yu didn't mean what he said. He doesn't remember you, and he doesn't remember Yueyao either. It's understandable that he treats you as an enemy." Mu Yaja agreed with Gong Jie and said comfortingly, "Take it slow." "What if," Xianxia said worriedly, "what if he can't remember me for the rest of his life?" "Don't be so pessimistic," Gong Jie said with a headache. "Compared to you, I'm more worried about you." He was worried that she would be disappointed, despaired, upset, and unable to recover from this setback. Xianxia shook her head and said calmly, "No, I won't. I will become stronger. At this time, Yu needs me more. Xiao Jie, don't worry." She smiled at him. Gong Jie took Yueyao from her arms. Seeing that she was still sulking with tears hanging from the corners of her eyes, he kissed the corner of her eyes and coaxed, "Yueyao, don't cry. Uncle will carry you." "Uncle?" Yueyao threw herself into his arms and wrapped her arms around his neck. Gong Jie was overjoyed. It was rare for Yueyao to be so close to him. She took the initiative to wrap her arms around his neck. He couldn't help but kiss her again and again. He couldn't bear to part with her. Mu Yaja said coldly, "If you like it so much, give birth to one yourself." Gong Jie snorted. "No, I love Yueyao the most." As he spoke, he subconsciously shielded her, worried that Mu Yaja would snatch Yueyao from his arms. When Xianxia saw these two clowns, her mood finally recovered a little. It was as if sunlight had shone into her heart. It didn't matter. It didn't matter that Yu didn't remember her. She would try her best to make him remember her. It was late at night. Yu lay in bed. Even though he hadn't eaten for a day, he didn't feel hungry. He always carried the medicine that Alice had concocted with him. To a certain extent, these medicines would make him feel full and replenish his various bodily functions. He looked at the ceiling. There was no emotion in his cold eyes. Suddenly, footsteps came from outside the door. Following that, there was a long silence. It seemed that the person hesitated for a long time. Finally, she took the doorknob and pushed the door open. In the darkness, the footsteps slowly walked in. Yu's handsome brows were slightly raised. He closed his eyes but didn't close them tightly. Through the gaps of his eyes, he saw a slender figure slowly walk to his bedside and sit on the edge of the bed quietly. "Yu, A fair hand slowly caressed his cheek and tucked his hair behind his ear. Chapter 3587. Yu did not say a word and pretended to be asleep. Xianxia looked at him quietly. She could not wait to make up for the yearning she had for him over the past year through this one look. This one look felt like 10,000 years. She could not help but recall how he looked when he was just born. His wrinkled little face was red. After being rescued and returned to the incubator, he looked so weak that it was as if he would leave her at any time. She had just gone through childbirth, but she still insisted on visiting him every hour with Xianxia's help. In the beginning, she was weak, but later on, she slowly regained some vitality. Her two small hands began to wave and grasp the air. Her legs also began to kick. The first time she took him out of the incubator to feed him, he was born prematurely at 8 months. He was so small that he was as light as a feather. She still remembered the first time he opened his eyes. Those jet-black eyes were like inlaid agates, filled with a lively luster. He opened his eyes and smiled at her, revealing his pink gums. The first time he said, "Mommy," was inadvertently when she was busy tripping rice noodles for him. The little guy was playing with his toys when he suddenly said, "Mommy." She turned around in surprise and walked up to him. She asked him to say it again, but he only cared about his toys and smiled at her foolishly. He did not say it again. However, Xianxia was still so excited that she could not calm herself down. God knew how long she had been waiting for this sentence. Every time she taught him how to pronounce it, she would exaggeratedly open her mouth and he would be amused by her. Gradually, he grew up and became more mischievous. However, at this time, his body was still weak and he often had to go to the hospital. Thus, throughout the year, the empty ward had become his permanent base. She remembered one time when he was very active and rolled down from the hospital bed. She was so shocked that she rushed over and picked him up. He cried out loud in pain. He rarely cried. Even when he was injected, he was so stubborn that he did not shed a single tear. This fall, however, he cried and hugged her tightly. She coaxed him for a while before he finally stopped crying. He grabbed her clothes and quietly fell asleep. It wasn't until he was 5 years old that his physical condition gradually stabilized. She liked to take him to the park for a walk. Every time she came back at noon, he would obediently prepare lunch and wait for her to come and have lunch together. He didn't know how to cook from the very beginning. At first, when he learned how to cook, the fried rice turned into a black paste. She was so angry that she scolded him and told him not to go into the kitchen without permission. It wasn't because the food he made wasn't delicious, but she was worried that he would cut his hand with a knife at such a young age. What if he accidentally caught fire? She didn't dare imagine what would happen. However, Yu's talent in cooking seemed to be innate. As time passed, the food she cooked became more and more delicious. From Chinese food, to Western food, to Japanese food, to Italian food, it was all very easy for him. She was touched, but her heart ached at the same time. Even if the Yu who knew how to dote on mommy, the Yu who knew how to do housework, the Yu who knew how to cook, the Yu who knew how to do housework, the Yu who knew how to cook, and the Yu who was very, very capable never came back, it's fine. Chapter 3588. Xianxia hugged his shoulders and her tears fell uncontrollably onto his face. Whether you remember it or not, you'll always be mommy's Yu. Mommy really misses you, really, really misses you. It's mommy's fault. Mommy didn't protect you well. No matter how harsh or heartless you are, mommy won't blame you. But don't leave mommy again. Boiling hot tears continuously dripped onto his cheeks and rolled down his cheeks endlessly. She held his face in her hands and gently kissed his forehead. Her tears fell straight onto his eyelashes, slid through his eyes, and trickled down from the corners of his eyes. Yu could only feel his vision becoming blurry. Her tears seemed to flow from her eyes and into his heart. His heart tightened and convulsed inexplicably. He felt as if he was going to suffocate and turn the world upside down. Why was she crying? Don't cry. Her tears made his heart feel like it was going to explode. Why did her tears cause him to lose control of himself? Hearing her sobbing, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his heart, as if it was going to pierce through his heart. What was going on? What exactly was going on? Yu suddenly felt a sharp pain in his head. His heart was in a mess and he couldn't help but frown. When he came back to his senses, he felt Xianxia's body stiffen. He then realized that his arms had unknowingly wrapped around her shoulders. It was as if he had lost control and hugged her uncontrollably. Yu was so shocked that he pushed her away and sat up on the bed. Although he tried to hide it, he couldn't hide the embarrassment that he was showing at this moment. Xianxia came back to her senses and stared at him in disbelief. Yu's breathing quickened. He stared at her warily and leaned his back against the bed. He said coldly, "Are you done crying?" Xianxia was stunned. His change was so sudden that she was not mentally prepared. When he hugged her just now, she really thought that Yu was back. However, it was just a moment of joy before everything returned to normal. Yu said coldly, "You don't have to show such an expression." He turned his head and looked out the window, deliberately not looking at her lamenting expression. "Yu, do you know why I call you Yu?" Xianxia said, "When you were born prematurely and almost died. I'm glad that God's blessing. You are the best gift to me. That's why I named you Yun Tianyu." How interesting. I'll say this one last time. My name is Gong Fan, not Yun Tianyu. As he said that, his head was suddenly felt. He was in pain. She asked worriedly, "What's wrong? Do you have a headache?" She rushed out of the door in a hurry, found the medicine box, and rummaged through it. Finally, she found the painkillers. Carrying a glass of water, she walked into the room and passed it to him. "This is a painkiller. Take it, and your head won't hurt anymore. Enough." Yu had a splitting headache and was extremely irritated. The berserk factor in his body was fermenting. He flung her hand away. "Go away." Chapter 3589. The sudden movement caused the two of them to freeze. Yu stared at the shattered glass on the floor, feeling inexplicably frustrated. Xianxia lowered her head and stared at the shattered glass. For a moment, she couldn't figure out whether it was the glass that had shattered or her heart. Xianxia pursed her lips as tears rolled down her cheeks. Suddenly, she knelt down on one knee and picked up the shattered glass pieces. "Mommy, in the future, let's use the same glass as a family of 4, okay?" She could still remember how Yu had excitedly brought 5 glasses to Yueyao not long after she was born. 3 of the glasses had adorable suns on them while the other 2 had beautiful moons on them. Yu had said that his daddy, Xianxia, and he were the suns that protected the moons and gave them warmth. The moons were bright because of the suns. Gongjie even threw a tantrum at one point, displeased that none of the 5 cups belonged to him. However, Yu had muttered, "You're a married uncle, and you're a spilled bucket of water. It's not yours." He had carefully placed the 5 glasses on the rack and marked them separately. Her tears continued to drip onto the carpet, staining it. She picked up the shattered glass pieces bit by bit until her gaze fell on the suns. Suddenly, her fingertips started to tremble uncontrollably. In a moment of carelessness, she accidentally cut her fingertips. A drop of blood appeared on the wound. However, she didn't feel the pain at all. She held the shattered glass pieces in her hands as her sad tears fell silently. When Yu saw this, especially when he saw Xianxia's tear-stained face, he couldn't help but grip the bedsheets tightly. The bedsheets were crumpled into a ball, just like his inner world at that moment. "Stop picking them up." Little did he know that the moment he finished speaking, Xianxia's tears fell even more violently and she started to sob. Yu frowned again. He felt a headache coming on when he heard her crying. He held his forehead and looked helplessly at Xianxia, who was squatting by the bed and holding back her tears. He didn't know what to do with her. In fact, you already knew why Alice came to the island. You also recognized Gongjie and me. The sea breeze on the island blew gently. Xianxia put on a jacket and sat on the beach. The bright moon seemed to be half submerged in the sea, but it also seemed to be rising from the sea. It was a beautiful sight. Lisa stood beside him and looked at the moon that seemed to be immersed in the sea. It was as if the sea water was the tears of the moon that had gathered to form the sea. She didn't say anything. She sat down beside Xianxia and gazed at the distant horizon. Her lips twitched as she said, I work for young Master Jie. How could I not recognize him? Xiao Yichen turned to look at her in surprise. So, you did it on purpose? On purpose? Lisa smiled. What do you mean on purpose? You knew that you and I were swapped, but you still allowed Gong Jie to take you away. Lisa didn't say anything, but it was a silent admission. Why? Xiao Yichen didn't understand. Isn't your mission and duty to take care of Yu? If he was taken away, it means that you didn't fulfill your duty. Aren't you worried that Gong Xiaoying will hold you accountable? Lisa didn't answer. Instead, she asked, do you know what faith is? Chapter 3590. What do you believe in? Xiao Yichen asked. Lisa looked at the moon and narrowed her eyes. She said mockingly, belief? I don't have any. Ever since she could remember, her family had been destroyed and her family had died. She and hundreds of other war orphans like her had been brought to Atlanta Island. On Atlanta Island, there was a fearsome assassin organization. Every year, they would recruit war orphans or refugees of different skin colors, ages, and genders from all over the world. Hundreds of children were locked up in a huge cage. They were only given a bowl of rice and a glass of water. Hundreds of children were only given a bowl of rice and a glass of water. Every child was hungry. What did this mean? This meant that even if they wanted to eat a mouthful of rice, they would have to face hundreds of children fighting each other. If they were hungry, they would only be given a bowl of rice. If they were thirsty, they would have a glass of water. In order to fill their stomachs and survive, the children would start to fight each other. Some were born weak and unwilling to fight. In the end, they could only starve to death. Most of the children would fight with their lives. Everyone wanted to live. No one was an exception. She was the same. At that time, her belief was that she did not want to go hungry. In the beginning, she was unable to recover from the setback. She was weak and could not compete with the children who formed cliques. However, hunger was like a beast. Once hungry, the primitive hunting instinct in her body would be fully activated. She started to fight and snatch. Gradually, from a mouthful of water to a mouthful of rice, until she could snatch half a bowl of rice and half a glass of water. Gradually, many children starved to death. Corpses were constantly being dragged away from the cage. However, the other children did not dare to leave the cage. They were like livestock in captivity. Later, a bowl of rice became half a bowl of rice, and a glass of water became half a glass of water. Eventually, they stopped eating and drinking. At that time, many children had already gone crazy. They were all brought from war-torn lands. Some were even natives. They did not have the concept of law and did not have the principle of killing or not killing. They only wanted to live. When they were hungry and uncomfortable, they wanted to eat. When there was no food, even if they gnawed the flesh of a living person, they would still devour it. Children who were unwilling to eat became living prey. At this time, it was necessary to resist those children who formed cliques. In the end, Lisa and the other children survived, but at that time, all the children were on the verge of death. She was not surprised. The moment she crawled out of the rope, she naively thought, was she finally free? The belief then was to live in this warm sunshine. However, after the children were brought out, they were immediately sent to the next round of devil training. The so-called devil training was hellish. The weak would die and the strong would survive. Perhaps, in the end, there would only be one person who could survive all the trials. Lisa was the only child who survived during that period. However, after the cruel competition, she didn't even have a basic belief. It was precisely because he had no faith that his heart ached for Yu. After the first personality was destroyed by the second personality, it became Gong Fan's Yu. It was like a numb and cruel zombie. It had no feelings, no beliefs, and no goals. Empty ambition. Chapter 3591. When she had first met Yu, this child was so special. On one hand, he was ruthless and unscrupulous. On the other hand, he was as warm as ever, just like the bright and beautiful sun shining on one's heart. However, this warmth was only vividly displayed in front of Xianxia. At that time, Yu was loved, knew how to love and enjoy being loved. He was blissful. Now, Yu was sitting there, but he was as empty as a painting. He was still as if there was no trace of life in him. She knew very well that Yu Yu was not happy at all. Therefore, she had deliberately let Yu Yu go. At least, when Yu Yu was brought back to the Mu family, there would be people who would love and protect him. They would not bear to use him. Now, her belief was that her little master would be able to smile from the bottom of his heart like he did in the past. Xiao Yichen took a deep look at Lisa. It was as if something in his heart had been deeply touched. Yun Shishir hugged the broken shards. Her tears kept falling onto the carpet and her lips were trembling. She did not even notice that the shards had cut her palms and blood was seeping out. Yu Yu casually switched on the wall lamp and saw the tears on her face clearly. At that moment, he did not know what to do. In the past, he had never felt so helpless. Now that he was faced with such a sad woman, it was as if there was an invisible hand mercilessly tearing his heart into pieces. He suddenly blurted out, "All right, don't cry." However, Yun Shishir was unmoved. When she thought of the 5 cups that Yu Yu had bought and one of them was missing, she was so sad that tears kept falling. "Don't cry." Yu Yu threw the table lamp on the floor in frustration. He did not know how to stop her tears, let alone how to comfort her. He only knew that when he saw her tears, his heart would also hurt. When he saw her sad, he would also feel very sad. Yun Shishir looked up and saw Yu Yu's impatient expression. She then stood up and left with the shards in her arms. Not long after, she came back in again. Wearing gloves and a vacuum cleaner, she cleaned up all the shards on the carpet. "You should sleep early." After Yun Shishir finished speaking, she awkwardly wiped her tears and left the room. Yu Yu looked in the direction of the closed door. She could not help but feel a little dazed. He lay down on the bed, but he could no longer fall asleep. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. No matter what, it was difficult for him to fall asleep. He suddenly sat up and got off the bed. He opened the door and walked to the living room. This was the first time he walked out of his room since he returned to the Mu family. On the table in the living room, there were a few pieces of paper towels. On the paper towels, there were a few pieces that formed a sun. Yun Shishir couldn't bear to throw it away, so she pieced the pieces together. Yu Yu glanced at it and his heart seemed to be in turmoil. He turned around and looked around. Suddenly, he saw a few white blankets on the cupboard beside the table. He frowned and walked over as if he was possessed by gods and demons. Yu Yu took the quilts and walked into the room. He sat in front of the study table and casually opened the drawer. There were a few boxes of paints in the drawer. He squeezed the paints into the palette, picked up a pen and dipped it in the paints. Then, he slowly drew a circle on the surface of the empty cup. Yu Yu suddenly realized that he was doing something childish. He frowned and put the cup on the table with a look of disgust. He turned around and was about to go to bed. Chapter 3592. In his mind, he couldn't help but recall Yun Shishir's misty, teary eyes. His heart was in a mess. Yu Yu looked at the cup on the table and hesitated. Finally, he sat back down. The next day, Yun Shishir walked to the room door and knocked gently, but there was no response. She pushed the door open and walked in. She saw Yu Yu wrapped in the blanket on the bed, still sleeping. She walked to the bedside quietly. She was worried that she would wake him up, so her footsteps were light and slow. As she walked past the study table, her gaze was attracted by a cup on the table. Yun Shishir followed his gaze. She remembered that this cup was used to serve guests. Why was it placed here? She casually picked up the cup, but from the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of the neatly packed paints and brushes, as well as the unwashed color palette. She couldn't help but be startled and slowly turned the cup over. On the other side, there was an exquisite simple drawing on the white surface of the cup. There was a small sun drawn on the cup. Although the strokes were simple, the drawing was exquisite. It was exactly the same as the sun on the cup that Yu Yu had bought previously. Yun Shishir's heart skipped a beat. This was drawn by Yu Yu? It was unbelievable. Yun Shishir looked at the bed. Yu Yu was still sleeping. He was curled up under the blanket and sleeping soundly. Her gaze fell on the cup again. The sun on the cup had been drawn for a long time and the paint had dried up. She felt warmth in her heart, as if the sun was shining on her. This was drawn by Yu Yu. Could it be that he had drawn a new cup because he had accidentally broken the cup yesterday? Xianxia was extremely touched at this thought. She held the cup lovingly. She left the room with the cup in her arms. In the living room, Wuxia was cleaning up the table. When he woke up in the morning, he saw the broken cup on the table. Xianxia pieced the sun together. He knew in his heart that Yu must have upset him again last night. Xianxia had always treated this cup like a treasure. During that period of time, she had always held this cup. This cup had accompanied her through the most torturous period of her life. However, now that it was broken, it was natural for her to be upset. For the entire morning, she was in low spirits and her eyes were swollen. It was obvious that she had cried a lot last night. When Xianxia walked into the living room with a cup drawn by Yu, she raised the cup in front of Wuxia as if she was presenting a treasure. She smiled and said, "Look, this was drawn by Yu." Wuxia couldn't help but be surprised. He took the cup from her hand. Xianxia was still worried as she reminded him, "Be careful. Don't drop it." "It won't drop." Wuxia comforted her. His gaze fell on the cup, but he smiled and said, "One look and I can tell that it was drawn by that little thing. Do you think that Yu drew this cup because he saw me sad, so that's probably it? Although he has lost his memories, there are some feelings in his bones that can't be cut off." Wuxia comforted her and said, "Don't worry and don't be too anxious. Take it slow. His memories will slowly recover." Xianxia was also encouraged. She nodded vigorously as hope ignited in her heart. Initially, she had thought that there was no hope for Yu to recover his memories. Chapter 3593. On the fourth day of Yu's return to the Mu family, he finally started to eat. Xianxia personally cooked a bowl of noodles. She wasn't a good cook, but in the past year or so when Yu wasn't around, she started to study her culinary skills. She started from recipes and attended some culinary training classes. Gradually, she was able to take charge of the kitchen. She brought the bowl of noodles into the room. Yu was sitting on the bed, flipping through the books on the bookshelf. When he saw her walk in, he put the books back into the bookshelf with an indifferent look on his face. Xianxia smiled and placed the bowl of noodles on the table. She said to him, "Yu, eat something. If you don't eat, you'll starve." When Yu heard this, he turned his face away. However, his attitude was no longer as repulsive as before. Instead, he said indifferently, "I don't want to eat." "You haven't eaten for 4 days." Xianxia pleaded, "Eat something, okay? Mommy will feed you." She paused for a moment. Worried that he would resist, she changed the way she addressed him. "I'll feed you." Yu sat in front of the study table and looked at her steadily. He didn't reject her, but he didn't agree either. Xianxia walked over to him tentatively. She moved a chair over and sat in front of him. With one hand, she used a fork to roll up the noodles and put it in his mouth. Yu looked at her expressionlessly. Suddenly, he opened his small mouth. Xianxia was overjoyed when she saw this. However, she didn't dare to show her happiness on her face. She suppressed her excitement and fed him. It wasn't until he swallowed the mouthful of noodles that she believed that he was willing to eat. If he was willing to eat, it was a huge breakthrough. She couldn't help but feel touched. She persuaded him again, "Eat another mouthful, okay?" Yu still felt awkward and didn't say anything. He just stared at the noodles in her hand. The noodles she cooked weren't that amazing, but perhaps he was really hungry. He actually felt that this bowl of noodles was very fragrant. Xianxia tried to feed him another mouthful of noodles, and he obediently opened his mouth and took another mouthful. When she saw it, she was so moved that she wanted to cry. The fact that he could eat was something she had never thought of. She even thought that if he was still unwilling to eat, she would really be at her wit's end. At that time, she would have no choice but to forcibly inject him with a nutrient solution. Now that he was willing to eat, Xianxia was greatly gratified. After what happened last night, the little fellow was no longer so resistant. The little guy finished the bowl full of noodles. Xianxia tried to feed him a few mouthfuls of soup, and Yu drank it obediently. As long as she fed him, he would no longer refuse. When Xianxia walked out of the room with the empty bowl, Gongjie came over. When he saw the empty bowl, he was a little suspicious. Is he willing to eat? Yun Shishir nodded agitatedly. Yes. This bowl of noodles was all eaten by him. Oh my God, Gong Jie widened his eyes in disbelief. He's finally willing to eat. It's just that his attitude towards me is still so cold. When he opened his mouth to eat the noodles, she even suspected that he had finally regained his memory. However, when she took the bowl of noodles and left the room, his back was still facing her coldly. He didn't even look at her once. She then realized that if he had really regained his memory, Yu wouldn't treat her so coldly. Chapter 3594. At night, when Yun Shishir finished cooking the noodles, Gong Jie volunteered to bring it into the room. Yun Shishir was a little hesitant, but Gong Jie said coquettishly, "Shishir, let me, as your uncle, perform a little." Alright. Gong Jie took the bowl of noodles from her hands. Yun Shishir cautioned him carefully, "Be careful, it's hot." Hence, Gong Jie carried the bowl of noodles into the room. However, within a few minutes, the sound of porcelain shattering could be heard from the room. Yun Shishir and Mu Yaja heard the commotion and stood up in shock. They rushed into the room, only to see Gong Jie standing at the side with a stunned expression. Yu was sitting on the bed, and the floor was littered with broken bowls and soup. It was a complete mess. Gong Jie turned his head innocently and glanced at Yun Shishir bitterly. He mouthed, "Yu is so fierce." It turned out that when he carried the bowl of noodles into the room, Yu heard the door open and thought that it was Yun Shishir. He sat up on the bed and saw that it was Gong Jie. When he carried the bowl of noodles in front of him and was about to feed him, Yu waved his hand coldly and knocked the bowl of noodles out of his hand onto the floor. After Yun Shishir cleaned up the mess on the floor, the three of them left the room. Gong Jie looked sad and lonely. "Why did he knock over your bowl of noodles?" Yun Shishir found it unbelievable. "What did you say?" Gong Jie said sadly, "I just brought it in and didn't say anything. But he knocked over my bowl of noodles." As he said this, he crossed his arms and said angrily, "That's too much." "How could it be?" Mu Yaja said, "Maybe it's because you're not likable as an uncle." Gong Jie was speechless. He was speechless. He said provocatively, "Brother-in-law, that means you're very confident. That kid must have knocked over the bowl of noodles that you brought in." Mu Yaja said confidently, "How is that possible? That is my son." Gong Jie said, "Try it then." "I'll give it a try then." Mu Yaja cooked the noodles and brought them in. Gong Jie stood at the door and started counting down. 5, 4, 3, 2. Before he could count to 1, the sound of porcelain being overturned came from the room again. Gong Jie and Yun Shishir walked in and saw Mu Yaja standing beside the bed with an ashen face. The floor was also in a mess. Yu sat on the bed with an unapproachable posture. His face was as cold as ever. Puchi, Gong Jie covered his mouth and held back his laughter. He had a smug expression on his face that said, "I was right, wasn't I?" Mu Yaja glared at him. Gong Jie glared back at him indignantly. Yun Shishir immediately said to Gong Jie, "Go out first." "Sister, go out?" Gong Jie left the room feeling wronged. Yun Shishir then said to Mu Yaja, "You go out too." Mu Yaja looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he left the room. Yun Shishir cleaned up the mess on the floor, cooked another bowl of noodles, and brought it into the room. In fact, she was feeling a little nervous. In the afternoon, Yu was willing to eat. Perhaps he was really starving. She didn't know if there would be a second time. Yun Shishir carefully inched closer to the bedside. Yu, who was leaning against the headboard, stared at her expressionlessly with a cold look on his face. She probed, "Eat something, okay?" Yu didn't say a word and just looked at her silently. Chapter 3595. The noodles have just been cooked and are still warm. As she said this, she lifted a mouthful of noodles and cautiously brought it to his mouth. Yu's gaze fell on the bowl of noodles and he suddenly raised his hand. Yun Shishir thought that he was going to knock the bowl over and instinctively retracted her hand. However, she saw him suddenly straighten the bowl of noodles. It turned out that her bowl of noodles was tilted to one side and was about to spill out. Yun Shishir's anxious heart then calmed down a little. However, she saw that Yu Yu obediently ate a mouthful of noodles and didn't show any signs of resistance. She was so excited that her hands were trembling. She had never expected that Yu Yu would really accept her. If it weren't for Mu Yaja and Gong Jie, she would have thought that Yu Yu was only eating because he was hungry. However, when Gong Jie and Mu Yaja came in, Yu Yu had knocked over the bowls in their hands. However, when she fed him, he didn't show any signs of resistance. Instead, he obediently ate a mouthful of noodles. Had he accepted her from the bottom of his heart? Xianxia was greatly encouraged. Even though he still didn't say anything and still looked cold, he didn't even look at her. However, his willingness to eat what she fed him made Xianxia's originally gloomy heart gradually brighten up. Halfway through the noodles, he lowered his head and refused to eat anymore. Xianxia persuaded again, Yu Yu, eat another mouthful. If you only eat this little, you'll be hungry at night. Yu Yu looked at her deeply. After a long time, he finally relented and ate another mouthful. When he finished the noodles, Xianxia asked him if he wanted some soup. He shook his head. However, she looked very surprised. Wouldn't he choke if he only ate noodles? However, she was already very touched when he finished the noodles, so she didn't ask for more. When she was about to clear the bowl, she asked, "Is it good?" Initially, she thought that he would remain silent like before. However, Yu Yu suddenly opened his mouth and said coldly, "It tastes awful." Xianxia was shocked. She picked up the bowl and drank a mouthful of soup. It was so salty that she frowned. So salty? How could he eat it? Xianxia felt a little guilty. It took a lot of willpower for him to finish all the noodles that tasted so bad. She could not help but laugh. She looked at Yu Yu and said in embarrassment, "It's so disgusting. It must have been hard on you." Yu Yu looked at her and smiled. She was stunned. When she smiled, she was very beautiful and charming. Especially, it made him feel an inexplicable warmth. It was like the most difficult sunlight in winter. His cold and stiff lips couldn't help but relax a little. However, when Xianxia looked at him again, he resumed his cold expression. He looked away and didn't want to look at her again. When Xianxia walked out with the bowl of noodles, Mu Yaja and Gong Jie gathered around. When they saw that there was only soup left in the bowl, they were so shocked that they couldn't close their mouths. "He ate it all?" "Yeah." Gong Jie immediately said unhappily, "That's not fair. Why did this fellow knock over our bowls when brother-in-law and I brought the noodles in?" Mu Yaja couldn't hold it in anymore. He glared at him and said, "Shut up." Gong Jie said, "That's the truth." Mu Yaja changed the topic. "In any case, it's a good thing that he's willing to eat, no matter who feeds him." Xianxia nodded. There were tears in her eyes. She immediately wiped them away with her fingers and smiled. This meant that Yu Yu had started to accept her. This was indeed an amazing breakthrough. Chapter 3596. She felt warm inside. She had accidentally spilled a lot of salt when she was cooking the noodles. Even so, he still finished all the noodles. As she thought of this, she felt both guilty and warm at the same time. Xianxia carried the new clothes into the room. Yu Yu was already lying down. When he saw her enter, he turned around and looked at her warily. He slowly sat up on the bed. Xianxia smiled and said, "Let me help you bathe, okay?" Yu Yu narrowed his eyes and frowned, but he still didn't say a word. Since he didn't say anything, Xianxia took it as a silent agreement. She walked to the bed and reached out to carry him. However, Yu Yu shrunk his shoulders and tried to avoid her. Xianxia picked him up at once. They hadn't seen each other for more than a year. He had grown taller and heavier than before. Carrying him was starting to take some effort. Yu Yu instinctively wrapped his arms around her neck and looked angry. "What are you doing?" "I'm carrying you to the bathroom." Xianxia pretended to sniff his body and said teasingly, "How many days has it been since you last bathed? Don't you feel that you stink?" Yu Yu's face turned strangely red. Xianxia continued, "I remember that you have a serious obsession with cleanliness. You'll go crazy if you don't bathe for a day. Now, you don't care about cleanliness that much?" Yu Yu flew into a rage out of humiliation. He glared at her and said, "Shut up. Let go." Xianxia became bolder. She didn't let go of him and carried him to the bathroom. The bathtub was already filled with water. Xianxia placed Yu Yu on the floor. She squatted in front of him and reached out to take off his clothes. However, Yu Yu turned his back to her and held his shirt tightly, not allowing her to touch him. Xianxia didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Was this guy being shy? Perhaps, after growing up, some men and women began to have different thoughts. In the past, you loved it when mommy bathed you. Why are you so shy now? Xianxia held back her laughter and turned his body around, only to see that he had a death grip on her collar, preventing her from unbuttoning his shirt. After holding it in for a while, he squeezed out 3 words, "Get out." "What? Are you shy?" Xianxia teased. "Which part of your body haven't I seen before?" As she spoke, she began to unbutton his shirt. Yu Yu was so frightened that she took a few steps back until she was forced into a corner. With no way out, she widened her eyes in shock and warned again, "Don't touch me." Her shocked and angry expression was like that of an innocent woman who had been violated. That can't be, right? She used to bathe him too. However, at that time, in order to train him to be independent, she had always let him wash by himself. Yu Yu had even been a little reluctant. Later, when Mu Yaja bathed him, he had complained that Mu Yaja wasn't gentle at all and always hurt him. Xianxia was amused. Even though Yu Yu had struggled, she still unbuttoned his shirt without a word. Yu Yu couldn't resist at all. He allowed her to take off his clothes and carry him into the bathtub. He curled up in a corner, his whole body submerged in the water, only half of his face above the water. His vigilant eyes were on her, full of resistance. He didn't want her to bathe him. He didn't like to be touched by the opposite sex. Xianxia knew that he was shy. As she smiled, she squeezed the shower gel into the shower gel, grabbed one of his arms and started to scrub it carefully. The moment she touched him, Yu Yu's body instantly froze like a rock and he didn't move at all. Chapter 3597. The bathroom was foggy. Gradually, Yu Yu relaxed. His muscles were no longer as tense as before. He allowed Xianxia to rub the foam on his body. Her technique was very gentle and light. As the foam rubbed on his body, his muscles and bones relaxed involuntarily. Xianxia then applied shampoo on his hair. She was very careful and did not let any of the foam into his eyes. Yu Yu could not help but fall into a daze for a long time because of her gentle technique. After the shower, Xianxia carried Yu Yu onto the absorbent mat. Then, she wrapped the large bathrobe around him and wiped his body. Yu Yu remained silent. However, he did not show any strong resistance. He was slowly accepting her. When she thought of this, Xianxia's heart was filled with warmth. She firmly believed that his memories would be erased. However, some blood ties could not be erased no matter what. She believed that Yu Yu would definitely recover. Xianxia carried Yu Yu into the room. However, she was not in a hurry to leave. Instead, she took out a thick stack of fairy tale books from the bedside table. In the past, Yu Yu loved it when she read him bedtime stories. When he was not around, these fairy tale books were secretly kept by Xiao Yichen. Xianxia thought that these books had been thrown away. She was sad for a long time. Then, she went to the bookstore and bought many more fairy tale books. She placed them on the bedside table in Yu Yu's room. Every time a new fairy tale book was released, she would buy all of them. Yu Yu looked at the fairy tale books in her hands strangely. His gaze was filled with doubt. "You don't remember? In the past, you loved it when mommy read you fairy tales." Xianxia flipped to a page. The first story was Andersen's fairy tale, The Daughter of the Sea. Her fingertips gently ran over the words. For a moment, she was filled with emotions. This was also the first fairy tale that she read for Yu Yu. At that time, Yu Yu was still young. She didn't really understand the story. After she read it a few more times, she finally understood that it was a tragic story. Yu Yu lay down on the bed, and Xianxia tucked him in. Daughter of the Sea. Have you heard of it? Yu Yu blinked but did not say anything. Xianxia said again, "You must not remember. I'll read it again, okay?" Yu Yu slowly closed her eyes. Xianxia held the book and began to read softly. In the depths of the vast ocean, there is a kingdom of fish. The Sea King had 6 beautiful daughters, especially the youngest, who was even more beautiful than her sisters. She was kind, pure, and had a beautiful voice. They lived freely and without worries in the sea. Sometimes, their grandmother would tell them some novel stories on the sea. This filled the youngest's heart with longing for the world at sea. As Xianxia read, memories of the past surfaced in her mind. It was as if she could see a 3-year-old Yu hugging a pillow and sitting on the bed, looking at her longingly. "Mommy, do these fish look the same as humans?" "No, they have the bodies of humans but the tails of fish." "Then how do they breathe in the sea?" Xianxia was suddenly put in a difficult position. She immediately said, "They are the spirits of the sea. They can swim and breathe freely in the sea." Chapter 3598. That's why, once they reach the sea, they can't walk anymore. Are there really mermaids in this world? Xianxia pretended to be mysterious. Who knows? I'll continue. The little princess finally reached the age of 15 and was allowed to float to the surface of the sea. She looked around excitedly, wanting to take in everything. At this moment, a large ship sailed by her side. There were many people dressed in gorgeous clothes on the ship celebrating the prince's birthday. The little mermaid was immediately attracted to the handsome prince. At this moment, there was a sudden storm and the waves destroyed the ship. The people fell into the water and sank to the bottom of the sea. The mermaid risked her life and rushed into the whirlpool to save the prince. She gently kissed the prince's forehead and hid in the water, silently waiting for someone to save him. At this moment, a young lady found the prince. She called some people and saved the prince. When the story reached the part where the little mermaid wanted to turn her fishtail into legs, she found a witch and drank a magic potion. However, it was extremely painful to turn into human legs. Every step she took, she had to endure great pain. Yu's heart clenched. He hugged Xianxia's arm and said sadly, "Will the little mermaid die?" She smiled. "No, I won't." "That's good." Yu was relieved again. The story continued. The witch told him that if the prince forgot his parents because of love and married the little mermaid, she would obtain an immortal soul. However, if the prince married another lady, the little mermaid would die the morning before the wedding and turn into foam in the sea. The little mermaid's face was pale, but she was not afraid. As a reward, the witch cut off her tongue and took away her beautiful voice. She could no longer speak. Late at night, the little mermaid left her family and left heartbroken. When she came to the sea, she drank the potion but fainted because of the pain. When she woke up, the prince asked her questions. She could not answer because she was mute. However, she endured the pain and danced for the prince. When Yu heard this, he frowned and looked very distressed. As the story went on, Yu stopped talking. Especially when she heard that the prince didn't know that it was the little mermaid who saved her. He wanted to marry the princess and invited the little mermaid to dance for them. On the night before the wedding, the sisters floated to the surface of the sea. It turned out that in order to save their sister, they cut off their hair and gave them a sharp knife. As long as the little mermaid pierced the prince's chest, she could return to the sea. This was his last chance. His memories overlapped with the scene before him. Xianxia looked at Yu, who was lying on the bed. Everything had changed. He lay on the bed with his eyes closed, but no one knew if he was asleep or awake. Xianxia gently stroked his forehead, closed the book, and was about to leave. When she got up, Little Bun suddenly opened his eyes and asked coldly, "Did she kill that prince?" Xianxia was stunned and turned around. Under the moonlight, Yu slowly sat up from the bed. Her cold eyes revealed a hint of curiosity. Did she use that knife to kill that prince? Xianxia shook her head. No. No. Yu said doubtfully, if she didn't kill that prince, she would have turned into foam. Chapter 3599. Xianxia returned to the bedside and caressed his cheek gently. At night, she came to the prince's room and gave him a kiss. As she spoke, she bent down and kissed Yu gently on his forehead. Yu was stunned and his eyes widened in shock. She didn't kill the prince because she didn't have her tail and couldn't return to the sea. At the prince's wedding, she endured the pain and danced. In the end, she turned into foam and disappeared forever. Yu asked, "Why? Why didn't she kill the prince? This prince is ungrateful. It was the little mermaid who saved him. He seemed to be filled with righteous indignation. When Xianxia heard this, she suddenly laughed. Yu had already immersed himself in this story and his emotions. Just like in the past, when he heard this story, Yu clenched his fists and asked sadly, "If it were me, I would definitely kill the prince and return to the sea to be with my family." Because the little mermaid loves the prince very much. Even if she had to sacrifice herself, she wouldn't be willing to hurt the prince. Yu sneered. "If it were me, I wouldn't sacrifice myself for someone who doesn't love me." Xianxia was frightened by his cold gaze. The Yu of the past would not have such a cold gaze when he heard this story. This was a pair of eyes that were filled with hostility. There was a murderous aura that the Yu of the past would not have. Xianxia hugged him tightly, feeling uneasy. "You, don't be like this." Yu was hugged by her warm embrace. For a moment, his heart calmed down. Not everything can be solved by killing. Xianxia said again, "You weren't like this in the past." Yu suddenly pushed her away and said expressionlessly, "In this world, the weak are prey to the strong. Only by becoming strong enough can one's own interests not be infringed upon." Xianxia was stunned. She suddenly remembered what Yu had said to her in the past. Only by becoming stronger can you protect the people you want to protect. "Mommy, I want to protect you, so I must become strong. That way no one can hurt you." "Yu, why do you want to become stronger now?" Yu could not help but stare blankly. This question stumped him. That was right. What was he doing now? What was the purpose of him becoming so powerful? Yu's gaze suddenly fell on her hand. In the past, Yu wanted to become stronger because he wanted to protect Xianxia. But now, he had lost his goal and didn't know where to go. He said in a daze, "Only by being strong can one not be reduced to being dominated by others." In this world, the weak were prey to the strong. She didn't deny that. To become strong, one had to be built on the pain of the weak. She also couldn't deny that. However, if the strong became apathetic, cold, and heartless, then what was the meaning of life for such a strong person? "I'm tired." Yu turned away and did not look at her. "I want to sleep." Xianxia furrowed her brows and did not say anything more until he lay down. She covered him with the blanket and left quietly. However, lying on the bed, Yu tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. When he said that he was tired and wanted to sleep, it was just an excuse. Chapter 3600. It was a mess for no reason. Her embrace was very warm and made him yearn for it. He actually couldn't help but want to hug her back tightly. It was just that this warmth made him feel at a loss, lost, and confused. Why did he rely on this warmth? She kept telling him how he used to be and how he used to be. But was there really a past? Yu suddenly felt a splitting headache. It was so painful, as if a pair of hands were tearing his head apart. Yu clutched his head in pain and his body curled up involuntarily. He was drenched in cold sweat. It was only at dawn that his headache eased a little. He wrapped himself in the blanket tiredly and fell asleep. When he woke up, it was already the afternoon of the next day. He slowly pushed open the door and saw Xianxia sitting on the sofa in the living room. She was humming softly as she knitted a small glove. On the floor, Yueyao was sitting on the blanket, hugging a teething stick and chewing on it. When she heard footsteps coming out of the room, Yueyao looked up. She was the first to notice Yu. Seeing him standing at the door, she immediately got up from the floor with her butt sticking out. She gripped the teething stick tightly and walked towards him step by step. "Brother!" She hobbled over to him. She loosened her grip and the teething stick fell to the floor. Xianxia heard the sound of something falling. She looked up and looked at Yu. She put the glove aside and said, You're awake?" Yu didn't say a word. He only lowered his head and looked at Yueyao. Yueyao had a pair of big eyes just like him. They were very attractive, especially those curly eyelashes. When she blinked, they fluttered like the wings of a butterfly and were very charming. Yueyao suddenly opened her arms. Her cherry lips opened and closed and she said in a soft and tender voice, "Brother, hug." This glutinous rice ball wanted brother to hug her. The little fellow was very forgetful. She had completely forgotten about Yu Yu's indifference towards her when she was asking for a hug. Yun Shirshir froze for a moment and looked nervously at Yu Yu. However, she saw that his attitude was no longer as cold as before. At least, when Yueyao walked towards him, he no longer dodged. "Big brother, hug me." Yu Yao stretched out her arms again and stood on her tiptoes. However, she lost her balance and fell on her butt. From start to finish, Yu Yu looked at her coldly and did not help her up. Yueyao fell, but she did not cry in a delicate manner. She only furrowed her delicate brows, clearly aggrieved. She got up from the ground on all fours and raised her head to look at Yu Yu, only to see that he was still cold and indifferent. For a moment, she was extremely sad. Her little mouth pouted high, and she looked like a storm was coming. Yun Shirshir knew from this that she was going to cry. She quickly stood up and was about to walk over to carry Yueyao when Yu Yu suddenly bent down and gently carried Yueyao. He was still a little unfamiliar with the way he carried his sister. He didn't even know how to use his arms to support her, but Yueyao was delighted to see him carry her. She hugged him tightly like a koala bear and didn't want to let go. She leaned on his shoulder affectionately and broke into a smile. Chapter 3601. For some reason, Yueyao was inexplicably close to Yu Yu. This surprised Yun Shirshir a little. After all, a child's memory was limited. Even before this, Yu Yu was the closest to her and doted on her the most. She liked to hug her every day, hold her phone, and take pictures of Yueyao non-stop like an idiot. However, at that time, Yueyao was incomparably cold to Yu Yu. However, Yu Yu had left for more than a year. Yueyao shouldn't have remembered. Yueyao hugged Yu Yu like a koala. Her little head rested on Yu Yu's shoulder, looking extremely satisfied. Yun Shirshir teased her and said, "Yueyao, where's Xiao Yichen?" She thought that Yueyao had mistaken Yu Yu for Xiao Yichen. When Yueyao finally started babbling, Xiao Yichen taught her to say her name. Yueyao also learned a skill, which was to recognize the names of all the family members, except for Yu Yu. When Yun Shirshir asked, "Where's Xiao Yichen?" Yueyao would often point at Xiao Yichen and ask, "Where's Mu Yaja?" She could also recognize the direction and point at Mu Yaja. Yun Shirshir didn't specially teach her Yu Yu's name. This name had become an unspeakable pain in her heart. Whether it was Mu Yaja or Gong Jie, they would avoid it as much as possible. Hence, Yueyao didn't know Yu Yu's name. However, Yu Yu and Xiao Yichen looked very similar, so they might have been confused. "Where's Xiao Yichen?" When Yueyao heard Yun Shirshir say Xiao Yichen's name, he couldn't help but look around. However, he didn't see Xiao Yichen, so he asked hesitantly, "Where's Xiao Yichen?" Yun Shirshir was stunned. If Yueyao mistook Yu Yu for Xiao Yichen, she would definitely point at Yu Yu. However, it did not. Yun Shirshir would never have thought that after more than a year, Yueyao actually remembered Yu Yu's appearance and could even differentiate Yu Yu from Xiao Yichen. When Yu Yu heard Yun Shirshir's question, he asked suspiciously, "Who's Xiao Yichen?" Yun Shirshir said gently, "Xiao Yichen is your older brother. You're twins and look exactly the same. No one can tell the difference. Other than your family members, I didn't expect Yueyao to be able to differentiate between you and Xiao Yichen." After a pause, Yun Shirshir said sadly, "After all, when Yueyao was not even a year old, you got into trouble." When Yu Yu heard this, his thoughts were a little confused. "I have an older brother?" Yu Yu looked a little surprised. Yun Shirshir immediately took out a photo. It was a family photo and she showed it to Yu Yu. Yu Yu looked at the photo. It was a family photo. Yun Shirshir was sitting with Yueyao in her arms. Two children who looked exactly like him were standing on both sides. It was sunset. Of the two children, one had a gentle smile while the other had a sunny smile. Their eyebrows and eyes were exactly the same, except for a slight difference in height. Even he could not tell which child was his own. This was the first time he saw a family photo like this after he returned to the Mu family. At first glance, it was a huge shock. Yun Shirshir had always said that he was her son and her baby. Yu Yu had always been suspicious. The reason why he was not so resistant and close to her now was not because he believed that he was her son. It was because he did not know why he was not so resistant and close to her. However, when he saw this photo, Yu Yu could not help but wonder if what she said was true. Was he really her family? Was that possible? Chapter 3602. Alice had instilled memories in him. He was the son of the Gong family and had always been in poor health, so he had been receiving physiotherapy on Ashland Island. He didn't know who his mother was, nor did he know who his siblings were. He only knew that he had an uncle called Gong Jie. However, even Gong Jie told him that his real name was not Mu Yaja. His real name was Yun Tianyu, and he was the son of Mu Yaja and Yun Shirshir. He could not digest this information for a while. It was complete nonsense. He had been in the Gong family all this time and did not have any memories of Mu Yaja, Yun Shirshir, and even Xiao Yichen. It was just that the photo made his thoughts chaotic for a moment. Yu lowered his head to look at Yueyao, who was in his arms. Yueyao also looked up at him. Seeing him staring at him, the little guy reached out his soft hands and gently patted his face. It was so fun. Yu did not find it annoying. Her scratches did not hurt much, and her nails were neatly trimmed. Hence, when she pinched herself, it did not hurt or itch. Yu was no longer as resistant to this child as before. He avoided her as if she were a snake or a scorpion. This change made Yun Shirshir feel relieved. Did he quickly improve on the day he regained his memories? During dinner, Yun Shirshir personally cooked. When Gong Jie and Mu Yaja returned, the dishes were already on the table. What surprised them was not that Yun Shirshir cooked for the first time, but that they saw Yu sitting at the dining table with Yueyao sitting on the baby stool and playing with a toy. He lazily propped his chin on his hand and quietly watched her play with the toy. This guy actually walked out of his room. This was a miracle. After returning to the Mu family for such a long time, he had always locked himself in his room. He never came out of his room, never letting the sun out. Why did he come out now? Gong Jie and Mu Yaja looked at each other but did not show too much of a shock, lest they startled him. As usual, they sat down at the dining table. Yu did not look at them and continued to stare at Yueyao. Gong Jie had his own thoughts. Yu, this damn siscon. Why was he always staring at Yueyao? Was uncle not good looking? After being back for so many days, this brat had only glanced at him lightly when he smashed the bowl of noodles that he had brought out. He had not even looked at him directly. Gong's heart. Mu Yaja and Gong Jie stared at Yu fiercely and complained in their hearts. The two of them were not as good-looking as Yueyao, right? Yun Shirshir walked out with rice and saw that Gong Jie and Mu Yaja had returned. The two of them sat opposite Yu and the three of them formed a strange triangle. Her lips twitched as she placed the rice on the table. Let's eat. Yun Shirshir placed the rice noodles in front of Yueyao and tied a napkin around her before sitting down beside her. They started eating. Yu was stunned and did not move his chopsticks. When they were on Ashland Island, he had always eaten alone. He was used to having a quiet dining table and had never experienced this before. There were so many people sitting around the table and eating, but he did not feel uncomfortable at all. What are you waiting for? Yun Shirshir picked up a grilled chicken wing for him and said, "Eat it while it's hot." Yu picked up his chopsticks and started eating. Chapter 3603. Yu finally raised his eyes to look at him. It was just that this glance was cold and emotionless, and then, he pushed the vegetables away in disgust. He pushed them away. He had thought that he would just push them away, but unexpectedly, Yu picked up the vegetables and threw them into the small plate used for throwing the bones. Gong Jie's heart shattered with a smack. Mu Yaja muttered, "Yu doesn't like vegetables." Hence, he also picked up a drumstick and put it in his bowl. Yu didn't even look at it. He used his chopsticks and placed the drumstick on the table. Then he used his chopsticks to pick up the chicken wing that Yun Shirshir had given him and started eating. Mu Yaja was speechless. Gong Jie tried to hold back his laughter until his stomach hurt. He lowered his voice and said, "Brother-in-law, he doesn't want to eat the drumstick you gave him. Yu just doesn't like you." Mu Yaja turned around and smiled at him elegantly. Then he picked up a piece of red braised pork and stuffed it into his mouth. "Shut up and eat." Gong Jie couldn't speak with a piece of red braised pork stuffed into his mouth. He stared blankly at Mu Yaja as he calmly picked up his bowl and started eating. Yu finished the drumstick in his bowl and stopped eating. Yun Shirshir saw this and picked up some vegetables for him. Yu Yu hesitated for a while and ate the vegetables as well. Yueyao thought that it was fun. She suddenly scooped up some rice noodles with a spoon. She raised her little hand and stretched it in front of Yu Yu, wanting to feed him. Yueyao wasn't very good at using the spoon. She held the spoon in a reverse grip and the rice noodles dripped onto the table. Yu Yu looked at her in surprise, only to hear Yueyao mumble, "Okay." Xianxia said, "Yueyao is feeding you." Yu Yu was stunned for a few seconds. She stretched out her head and took the rice noodles that Yueyao handed her. The sticky rice noodles didn't have any extra seasoning. It was light, but there was a rich milky fragrance. Yu Yu took a bite. When Yueyao saw this, he was extremely excited. He danced around and scooped up another bite. His little hand held the spoon with great effort and raised it to his mouth. Yu Yu was a little conflicted. This rice noodle was not particularly delicious. It was a formula for babies, so it was tasteless. However, Yueyao insisted on feeding him. He didn't know if it was because he found it fun or something else. Yu Yu had no choice but to take another bite. Yueyao turned his head and smiled at Xianxia as if he was presenting a treasure. He revealed his cute little front teeth and said, "Mommy, brother is eating." Xianxia smiled and coaxed, "Okay. Yueyao, eat too." "No, I want to feed brother." As Yueyao spoke, she fed Yu Yu mouthful by mouthful. After that, Yu Yu was full just by eating the rice noodles. Xianxia was holding back her laughter. She was a little surprised that Yu Yu didn't show any resistance to Yueyao's closeness. Even when Yueyao fed him, Yu Yu didn't reject it. Opposite them, the two men who had been ignored from the start to the end were frowning. Gong Jie didn't believe it and picked up another wing root. Yu Yu didn't even look at it and removed it. There was nothing to say. Gong Jie couldn't take it anymore and protested, "What's the difference between the wing root I picked up and the one your mommy picked up?" This was the love of an uncle. Yu Yu said coldly, "It's dirty. There's saliva. It's not hygienic." Gong Jie was puzzled. Didn't Xianxia's chopsticks have saliva on them? Yueyao's spoon was full of saliva. Why didn't he dislike it? Chapter 3604. After dinner, Yu Yu was about to go back to his room when Gong Jie suddenly put his arm around his shoulder and said, "What are you doing in your room every day? Cultivating?" Yu Yu slapped his hand away and glared at him as if to warn him, "Don't touch me." "Why are you glaring at me?" Gong Jie said confidently, "I'm doing this for your own good. If you weren't my biological nephew, I wouldn't have anything to do with you lying in your room until your limbs degenerate." Xianxia added, "That's right, you can't stay in your room every day. You have to go out for a walk once in a while." When Mu Yaja heard this, he suddenly said to Xianxia, "Why don't we take him out for a walk? Who knows, it might be good for him to recover his memory." Xianxia felt that this made sense. Gong Jie also said, "I heard that there's an open-air music festival at Manhe Square tonight. It starts at 8 p.m. Why don't we go to the music festival?" Xianxia agreed readily. Gong Jie was about to carry Yueyao when Xianxia immediately said, "Yueyao can't go. It's too noisy at an open-air music festival. Yueyao will cry." Then, what about Yueyao? Although there was a nanny, Yueyao couldn't be left alone. No one was assured. Mu Yaja said matter-of-factly, "As his uncle, you should stay and take care of Yueyao." When Gong Jie heard this, he couldn't take it anymore. "No way. Why should I?" He hooked his arm around Mu Yaja's shoulder and said disdainfully, "Don't think I don't know what you're thinking. You must be thinking of using the music festival to communicate with Yu Yu." "No way, I want to go too." "What's wrong with the three of us communicating? Hey, are you being xenophobic?" Gong Jie was not convinced and said, "I also want to communicate with my nephew." Mu Yaja said coldly, "Your surname is Gong, not Mu. You and I are not family." Gong Jie. Xianxia added, "Shao Jie, you can stay at home and take care of Yueyao." Mu Yaja continued, "Well, you don't like Yueyao very much. Now, no one is fighting with you for a hug. Be good." After that, Mu Yaja picked up Yu Yu and left with Xianxia. Gong Jie was left standing alone in the living room, unable to express his bitterness. He didn't know if he should curse her or not. Was he being treated as a babysitter? Just as Gong Jie was about to explode, Yueyao suddenly walked to his side, squatted down, and secretly stuffed a toy into his trousers. Ha! Yueyao let out a string of bell-like laughter. She grabbed his trousers and tugged. Gong Jie lowered his head and saw that she was having fun playing with his trousers. His eyes couldn't help but soften. He immediately squatted down and pulled her into his arms. Yueyao, uncle will accompany you at home, okay? Yueyao suddenly raised her chubby little paw and slapped his face. Gong Jie's face darkened. He grabbed her little paw and said, "You're not allowed to hit uncle's face." Yueyao slapped his face again. Gong Jie frowned unhappily. However, when he saw Yueyao's heartless smile, which made him want to dote on her, he suddenly gave in. He curved his lips and gently kissed her cheek. "Yueyao, be good. Daddy and Mommy don't want you, but Uncle wants you." Yueyao suddenly pinched his cheek and pulled it until it was deformed. She was amused by his distorted handsome face and couldn't stop laughing. It was only half an hour's drive from Manha Square. Chapter 3605. Yu let her hug him obediently. He looked out of the window. The passing scenery seemed familiar. Was this the place where he used to live? Especially when they passed by the park and the bridge across the river. Xianxia saw that he was staring at the bridge and immediately said, "You, do you still remember? We used to set off fireworks here during the Lunar New Year." "Fireworks?" "Yeah." Xianxia continued, "At that time, you were fighting to set off fireworks. I didn't let you do it in the past, so you felt that it was a novelty and wanted to light your own fireworks. I was a little scared." Yu stared at the bridge curiously. Through the window, he could see many people standing under the bridge, sitting on long benches or flying kites. The kites were luminous and many of them were bobbing in the wind. He couldn't help but be entranced by the sight. Wuxia steered the kite as he looked at Yu through the rearview mirror. His heart was filled with emotions. Yu had disappeared for a year and everyone was thinking about him. Although no one gave up easily, as time passed, the hope in their hearts gradually disappeared without a trace. However, no one dared to give up. Because if they gave up, it would mean that in their hearts, Yu was really dead. At that time, the search became their motivation to persevere. When Yu really came back, Wuxia didn't show it on his face, but in fact, he was ecstatic. His son was still alive. He had come back alive. However, as a father, he had to maintain his composure. Hence, he didn't show it on his face. However, his care and patience for Yu was no less than Xianxia's. Even if Yu didn't acknowledge him and didn't remember him, it didn't matter. Yu would always be Wuxia's son. This was a fact that even the heavens couldn't change. Many people gathered in Manha Square. The weather was perfect for the open-air music festival. There was no rain. Everyone gathered in the square. At a glance, the square was filled with people. Among the crowd, there were people constantly waving their light sticks, forming a sea of stars. There were too many people, probably in the tens of thousands. With so many people, it was too dangerous. If there was any commotion, a stampede could easily occur. Xianxia was a little worried. She had always had a lot of concerns. After all, women were more meticulous. Moreover, there were many reports on the news that said that in crowded places, if it wasn't a stampede, it was a crush, or it was a fall and bruise. With so many people around, it was inevitable. Therefore, she hugged Yu even tighter. "Why are there so many people?" Xianxia muttered and looked around. They had arrived relatively early, but because they arrived early, the crowd had blocked the only exit. For a moment, they could not advance or retreat. People kept pushing and shoving, trying to get to the front, the closest place to the stage. There were too many people. If she had known that there would be so many people, Xianxia wouldn't have come. However, since she was already here, she might as well make the best of it. Xianxia hugged Yu. Even so, it was still difficult for Yu to see the stage. However, he wasn't interested. He didn't like places with too many people, and he didn't like places that were too noisy. It was irritating. It was tiring. Chapter 3606. Xianxia, however, said, "No, it's too dangerous. There are so many people squeezing around. If you accidentally fall, you might hit your head." Wuxia felt that it made sense. Hence, he took Yu from Xianxia's arms, worried that she would be too tired to carry him. Yu was initially a little resistant in his arms and struggled a little. Wuxia said to him, "You're so heavy. Mommy's arms will get tired if I carry you all the time. Let Daddy carry you for a while, okay?" When Yu heard this, he didn't show any signs of resistance. He just turned his face away and refused to look at him. Obviously, he didn't appreciate it. However, he didn't refuse or resist again. Wuxia was already satisfied. On the stage, the band went on stage one after another to perform the songs. The atmosphere was instantly ignited. Everyone waved the light sticks in their hands and immersed themselves in the moving music. Yu was tone-deaf and wasn't particularly interested in music. However, when the third song started playing, it was an English song that strangely captured his attention. Imin harakani bodisi my am here. Can anyone see me? Can anybody help? Can anyone help me? Imin hiria prisoner of a story. I am here, a sinner of history. Kenio heramical? Can you hear me yelling? Arguing to Jetmino, will you take me away immediately? I've been waiting for you to rescue me. You must come and save me. Imin hearing calling a beauty I'm here. I'm shouting loudly, but no one can hear me. Can anybody help? Can anyone help me? I'm hysterical until I break down. I'm lost in the cage. Tell me there's still hope. Is there anyone outside listening? This was an English song. The meaning of the lyrics was about a lost person, trapped in the sad memories of the past, waiting to be redeemed and saved. However, this song actually made Yu feel an indescribable sadness in his heart. He gently closed his eyes. In the darkness, he could vaguely see a cage in the darkness where there was no light. A child who looked exactly like him was holding on to the cage tightly and shouting something. But he couldn't hear anything. He couldn't hear anything at all. In his ears, there was only the sound of music and the noise of people buzzing. The youth in the cage seemed to have seen him. He shook the iron bars and shouted crazily, "Let me out of here!" Yu furrowed his brows and was a little puzzled. "For you, let me out. I don't want to be here." The youth gripped the iron bars tightly and looked desperate. "I don't want to be here alone. Don't lock me up here alone." Between the iron bars, the youth's delicate face was pale. "Mommy, Daddy, can you hear me? Mommy." Yu. A series of urgent calls finally woke him up. When he woke up again, he was in Wuxia's arms. He seemed to have fainted. Wuxia and Xianxia were scared out of their wits. They kept patting his face until he finally woke up. However, when he opened his eyes, a line of tears suddenly fell from the corner of his eyes. Xianxia was shocked to see his tears. Just as she was about to caress his face, she saw a helpless look on the child's face. Mommy, he called her anxiously and frowned slightly. Chapter 3607. Xianxia was so excited and happy that he had taken the initiative to call her. For a moment, she was caught off guard. Just as she was about to hug him, the child in her arms suddenly pounced on her and hugged her tightly. His little hands hugged her tighter and tighter. Mommy, Yu missed you so much." Wuxia was also stunned. Xianxia was also stunned. That familiar voice was enough to make her heart burn. Xianxia hugged him even tighter in surprise. Yu, you're back. Is that you? Yu. Gongjie had told her about Yu's situation. Yu had dual personalities. One was the son of light, and the other was the son of darkness. One side was pure and innocent, while the other side was evil and cruel. Gongjie said that Yu's memory had been sealed, but his first personality had been killed by his second personality. Perhaps his memory could be recovered, but the innocent and kind Yu of the past might not be able to come back. When Xianxia first heard about this, she was shocked and flustered. She didn't know anything about dual personalities, nor did she know anything about the dark side. Her Yu was so pure and innocent. How could he be so cruel and cruel? But after that, she kept reading up on all kinds of information about dissociative identity disorder and dual personalities. There had always been many conflicts in the field of dissociative identity disorder. After all, the research in this field wasn't very deep. There weren't many patients with dissociative identity disorder in the world. However, some said that the first personality wouldn't be taken over by the other personalities. Some said that not only would the first personality be killed and taken over, but once another personality took over the body, the person would never be able to come back. Xianxia was also mentally prepared that Yu of the past would never be able to come back. Even though Yu had changed and had become cold and reclusive, she didn't dare to ask for more if he could come back alive. As long as Yu was safe and by her side, she would do her best to take good care of him. Even if the Yu of the past couldn't come back to her side, she didn't care. But in her heart, she still hoped for a miracle to happen. Even though this process might be more difficult than carrying a child for 10 months, she wasn't afraid. She also hoped that the Yu of the past could come back to her side. "You, are you back?" Xianxia. She was so excited that she hugged Yu tightly and burst out in tears. However, the crying of the child in her arms gradually stopped until it was dead silent and did not make a single sound. "Yu, oh, Yu. Yu, oh, you, oh. Of you, oh. Why are you crying?" Yu asked. Suddenly, he frowned and touched the corners of his eyes with his fingers. What he touched were the dried tears. What? Who was he crying to? Yu frowned strangely and wiped the tears away. Xianxia looked at him nervously and didn't move. She tried calling out to him carefully, "Yu." Yu looked at her coldly. He didn't respond or reject her. Just like before, his face was cold and emotionless. Xianxia's heart sank to the bottom of the abyss. Yu had disappeared again. Chapter 3608. How could this be? Yu. She thought that Yu was really back. She really thought that the gentle Yu from the past was back. But in the blink of an eye, he resumed his cold demeanor. How could this be? Xianxia said anxiously, "Just now, it was Yu," she cried to Wuxia, her heart aching. "Just now, I heard Yu calling me mommy." Wuxia hugged Xianxia's shoulders and kissed her forehead. "Xia, don't be like this. Don't be anxious. Didn't we agree to take it slow?" Xianxia turned around and looked at the child in her arms. Suddenly, she pleaded, "Please. Let Yu come back, please. I want to see Yu. I want to see Yu." She didn't know what nonsense she was spouting. But her mind was in a mess. The only thing she could realize was that there seemed to be two souls residing in this child's body. One was the Yu from the past. The other was the Yu who had been given the name Gong Fan. She missed Yu. She wanted to see that Yu again and hear him call her mommy. She wanted that Yu to come back. All this while, she had been waiting patiently. But her hope had been dashed again. Her disappointed expression had undoubtedly agitated the child. The child looked at her coldly and finally said, "I'm not Yu. Then let Yu come back, please?" She lowered her posture to the lowest possible level and was practically begging him with an incomparably pleading tone. The child suddenly felt frustrated. Yu. Hearing this name that didn't belong to him every day, his ears were about to grow calluses. So, this woman was being so gentle to him because she wanted to awaken that Yu? What she needed was Yu. Whether it was Xianxia, Wuxia, or Yueao, what they needed was Yu, not him. What was laughable was that he was actually moved by her gentleness. He actually instinctively yearned for this warmth and tenderness. Instinctively, he wanted to rely on her, wanted to hug her. However, from the beginning to the end, he was treated as another Yu. What she needed, what she loved, and what she missed was never him. All this while, he had been needed, cared for, and loved. It was all because they wanted to find the shadow of Yu in him. It was as if this body had always belonged to Yu, and he had been treated as an invader, occupying this body as an enemy. He had never been needed, or even rejected by them. Was he hated? Or rejected? He also wanted to try his best to adapt to the role of Yu. But he wasn't Yu. So, stop calling him Yu. The child was anxious and frustrated. He pushed her away forcefully. "I've said it before. I'm not Yu." Xianxia was pushed to the ground and her eyes were filled with shock. Wuxia also looked at him in disbelief. He didn't expect him to revert back to that cold and aloof self when he had just returned to the Mu family. The child was obviously losing control of his emotions. He stood up and his body swayed slightly. The child tried his best to stabilize himself and turned to look at Xianxia. He said in disappointment and anger, "Don't call me that again. I'm not Yu, I'm not Yu. Chapter 3609. Xianxia was heartbroken when she heard that. She immediately said, "You, don't say such silly things. How you not Yu? You're enough." Yu covered his ears uncontrollably and said in despair, "Don't call me that again." After he said that, he turned around and his slender figure disappeared into the bustling crowd. Xianxia chased after him anxiously. However, it was too crowded. Yu was not tall and was very skinny. He managed to squeeze through the crowd. However, she was blocked by the crowd. "What should we do?" Mu Yaja held her hand and comforted her. "Don't worry." He held her hand and followed the direction in which Yu had left. They pushed through the crowd and chased after him. "You," the voices were still ringing in his ears. Yu closed his eyes tightly. His fragile body seemed to be on the verge of collapsing in the crowd. "Don't call me that again. Don't." He finally calmed down. However, when he looked around, he was surrounded by the crowd. On the stage, rock music was playing intensely. The crowd was also excited by the explosive rhythm. Some of them sang loudly along with the music. Some of them screamed hysterically. Yu felt a little dizzy. He felt that the noise was getting further and further away. All he could hear was the buzzing of the crowd. "Excuse me." Someone rushed over and pushed through the crowd. When he saw Yu in front of him, he pushed him hard. Yu lost his balance and almost fell. There were so many people. If he fell, he would definitely be stepped on mercilessly by the crowd. Just as he was about to fall, an arm suddenly supported his center of gravity. "Are you okay?" A woman's gentle voice was heard. Yu frowned. He was a little surprised. Who was it? Was it her? Xianxia? When he raised his head, he saw a woman's face that he didn't recognize. The woman in front of him was delicate and pretty. Her every movement gave off a heroic aura that ordinary women did not have. Yu narrowed his eyes and sized her up. "You are..." Chu-ho looked at the child in front of him. He suddenly felt that he looked familiar, but he could not remember where he had seen him before. Behind her, Gu Jinglian walked over with baby Chu in his arms. Lin Shi followed beside him and was puzzled to see Chu-he grabbing a child's arm. Gu Jinglian's handsome face darkened when he saw the child's face clearly. "It's you." Yu turned to look at the man, and his eyes instantly turned gloomy. "Gu." When enemies met enemies, and Gu Jinglian's face turned pale when he saw Yu. Chu-ho was surprised when he saw his expression. "What's wrong? Do you know this child?" The man snorted coldly and said in an unfriendly tone, "I don't just know him." He also had a deep hatred. He still had a score to settle with this child. Yu took a step back cautiously. A tiger would be bullied by a dog. This was not Hurricane and he was alone. He would not gain anything if he went head-to-head with Gu Jinglian. Just as he was about to leave, Gu Jinglian grabbed him by the collar and lifted him up. "Why are you running?" Chapter 3610. He's just a child. "You, child?" Gu Jinglian sneered. "He's not an ordinary child." He turned his head and fixed his gaze on Yu's face. His eyes were cold. "He's from the Gong family, Gong Fan from the Hurricane group. He's not an ordinary child." Gong Fan. Hearing this name, Chu-ho's face also showed a surprised expression. Gong Fan. That was the child who had used her and Xiaobao as a hostage to force Gu Jinglian to sign the agreement to cede Worth to him? How could he be so young? She looked so soft and squishy. She couldn't tell how vicious and merciless this child was. Yu was very calm. He narrowed his eyes and said calmly, "Gu Jinglian, I dare you to touch me." Before he could finish speaking, Gu Jinglian flicked his finger hard on the man's forehead with a loud and crisp sound. Yu felt a concussion in his head and felt dizzy for a moment. He felt that his forehead was about to be shattered by this flick of his finger. Gu Jinglian said coldly, "This is my territory in Beijing. You asked me if I dared to touch you. What do you think? Yi was not afraid at all. He raised his leg and kicked him in his weakest spot. This move was ruthless, but Gu Jinglian had expected it and dodged in time. This child was really ruthless. Was this kick going to end his lineage? Gu Jinglian would not let him off so easily. He kicked him in the butt. Yu, who had nowhere to hide, took the full brunt of the kick. He frowned in pain, but he did not show it on his face and maintained his composure. Gu Jinglian. Before he could finish, Gu Jinglian pinched his face and pulled hard. Rumor has it that the ruthless successor of the Hurricane Group, Gong Fan, is just SOSO without those mercenaries and bodyguards. However, this little guy was weak, yet he was still so arrogant. Who was he trying to show off to? Showing off in his territory? Was he courting death? In a hotel room next to the square, a gray-haired middle-aged man sat on the windowsill with a bottle of wine in his hand. He was drunk and on the verge of collapsing. If it weren't for the guardrails outside the windows of the room, he would have lost his balance and fallen. He picked up the wine bottle and took a big gulp. When he opened his eyes again, there was a terrifying murderous intent in them. In the square, the crowd was bustling with noise. The crowd danced to the music, getting high. However, the livelier the crowd was, the more the man felt indignant. Just last month he was fired by the company. Half of his life, he worked hard for the company, but all he got in return was a letter of dismissal. He lost his job, and his wife left him with their child. Just a few days ago, he saw his wife walking on the street with another strange man. They looked so sweet. Only then did he suspect that his wife had betrayed him. For so many years, he had suffered untold hardships. In order to support his family, he had been constantly on the move every day. In order to support his family, he had almost exhausted all his energy. In the end, what did he get in return? In exchange, he was chased away by the company and betrayed by his wife. Even his son refused to meet him. He had wanted to visit him several times, but his son avoided him. He even said that he would never acknowledge him as his father. What did he do wrong? Chapter 36:11. He looked down at the crowd in the square. Every single one of them was so happy. He then looked at himself. He was like an orphan who was abandoned by the world. Why did the world only give him endless despair when the others were so happy? The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was unfair. Since the world had abandoned him, then don't blame him for taking revenge on the world. The man finished his glass of white wine in one gulp and took out an AK-47 from under the windowsill. He swayed as he crouched beside the windowsill. He held the gun and loaded it clumsily. Then he aimed the gun at the crowd and slowly pulled the trigger. He was already drunk. However, he did not need to aim in front of so many people. Every single one of them was worth it. Even if he died, he would not have lived in vain with so many people accompanying him to the grave. Suddenly, the man laughed arrogantly. Da-da-da-da. He pulled the trigger and fired wildly at the crowd. In the square, Gu Jinglian suddenly heard gunshots. He looked towards the direction of the sound. The square was too big, and the music on the stage was still loud. Therefore, he could not tell where the gunshots came from. Gunshots? Why were there gunshots? He could not have heard wrongly. Those were gunshots. Chu Ho also heard the gunshots that were almost drowned out by the noise. Based on the sound, it should be an AK-47. Someone was shooting at the crowd. Some of the people in the square suddenly screamed in fear. However, these screams were drowned out by the cheering crowd. The singer on the stage still did not realize what was going on. He was still sweating profusely as he held the microphone and performed with all his might. Most of the people in the crowd did not realize that the Grim Reaper was quietly approaching. Therefore, everyone was immersed in the music. The sound manipulator also realized that something was wrong. He received a radio message saying that someone was shooting at the crowd and asked for the music to be stopped immediately. The sound manipulator immediately stopped the music. The staff went on stage and covered the singer as he left the stage. The music suddenly stopped. Da-da-da. Gunshots were heard not far away. It was very obvious. It's gunshots. What's going on? It's a terrorist attack. Someone is shooting at the crowd. Some people were hit by bullets. Some bullets pierced through their heads, some pierced through their shoulders, and some pierced through their chests. For a moment, the huge square was shrouded in blood and darkness. Seeing that their companions were injured, many people were so frightened that they screamed and cried. "Help! Someone's injured, call an ambulance." However, at this time, most people were focused on running for their lives. How could they care about others? The crowd frantically rushed towards the exit. Many people who were shot and fell to the ground were once again trampled by the frenzied crowd. Some who were still breathing were directly trampled to death. Some were running for their lives, while others were crying. For a moment, the scene was chaotic and chaotic. Yu Yu's eyes flashed with astonishment when he heard the gunshot too. Someone opened fire? Chu Ho turned to look at Gu Jinglian. "Get out of here." She immediately crouched down and carried Yu Yu. Gu Jinglian carried Xiao Bao and held Lin Shi's hand as they ran towards the exit of the square. "Crouch down," Gu Jinglian ordered Chu Ho. Chapter 36:12. At this moment, Yu Yu suddenly thought of Yun Shirshir. She and Muyazhe were still at the square. They were in danger. Yu Yu started to struggle. "Let go of me," Gu Jinglian said angrily. "Are you crazy? Do you want to die?" "Let go of me," Yu Yu said to Chu Ho. "I want to go back." Chu Ho did not allow him to struggle and hugged him even tighter. "It's too dangerous to go back. Quickly leave this place." Yu Yu said coldly, "I don't need you to care about me. Let go of me." "Impossible." Chu Ho had a strong sense of justice. No matter what, Yu Yu was just a child. She could not leave a child in such a dangerous place. Yu Yu grabbed her collar tightly. "I said, let go of me. You don't have to be responsible for my life or death." As he said that, he kicked Chu Ho hard. Chu Ho felt the pain and almost fell down. This was a rare opportunity. Yu Yu broke free from her grip and ran towards the crowd after regaining his senses. Chu Ho turned around in shock. She could not believe it. Usually, a child in this situation, like Xiao Bao, would have panicked and run away. He would be so scared that he would hide in an adult's arms and tremble in fear. Even someone as calm as Lin Shi would obediently hold Gu Jinglian's hand and go with the flow. However, this child insisted on walking into the crowd. Did he not know that the gunman was lying in ambush in some corner and was shooting randomly at the crowd? The more people there were, the more dangerous it was. There was a possibility of being shot at any time. Moreover, bullets did not have eyes. No one knew how many bullets the shooter had in his hands. In such a big square, there were so many people. Everyone was a live target. It was obvious that this was a terrorist attack. There was no premeditated plan or target. It was purely for venting and revenge. Going back would be suicide. Gu Jinglian said coldly, "Don't bother about him." No one could stop a person who wanted to die. When he returned to the crowd, Yu scanned the crowd with his eyes. However, his height was limited. Just maintaining the center of the crowd and not being knocked down by the people running away in a panic was already exhausting. He looked around anxiously as he avoided the crowd. Just as he was about to shout, "Mom," his voice stopped abruptly. In his subjective consciousness, he was unwilling to be called this name. But now, if he didn't call them that, how would he find them and meet up with them? Where are they? Are they still in the square? No way. They must be looking for him everywhere. They must still be here. Yu Yu couldn't care less anymore. She shouted at the top of her lungs, "Mommy! Daddy! Where are you?" He was like a small boat, desperately going against the flow of people, running towards the center of the square. "Mommy! Daddy!" He turned around and searched every face. Suddenly, he saw a familiar figure. He rushed forward and grabbed the hem of that person's shirt. "Mommy!" The woman turned around, but her face was covered in blood. She pushed his hand away almost instantly and ran towards the exit, following the flow of people. It wasn't her. Then where could she be? Yu Yu was even more flustered. He continued to go against the flow of people. "Mommy! Mommy!" Gradually, his voice sounded like he was about to cry. He looked around helplessly. The lights on the stage were off. The square was plunged into a deathly silence. Chapter 36:13. Mommy, Yu kept searching in the crowd. He did not dare to look in one direction as he was afraid that he would miss something. However, just as he was looking deeper into the crowd, he heard gunshots. Not far away, the gunmen were still hiding in the dark and kept shooting at the crowd. Swoosh! Yu felt the bullet graze his hair. In the next second, an endless amount of hot blood suddenly splashed onto his face. The bullet mercilessly pierced the neck of a woman beside him. The woman fell to the ground. Yu was standing beside her. His warm body pressed her under him. Yu was shocked. He felt the world spinning around him. He could only feel a heavy body pressing on top of him. He tried to push her away, but the woman's body gradually turned cold. When he pushed her, her head flipped over, revealing a pair of empty and withered eyes. Because it was too sudden, she was hit all of a sudden. She even maintained a panicked expression on her face as she fled. There was no sign of life. Her face was as white as a sheet of paper. Her dark eyes were like an endless abyss that could swallow him up at any time. There was a bloody hole on her neck. The bullet had penetrated her neck and there was an explosive wound. The hot blood kept flowing on his body. It was sticky, warm, and smelled fishy. Yu was so scared that he could not speak. It was not that he had never seen a dead person, but he had never been so close to a corpse. He could even see from the woman's eyes how helpless, hesitant, perplexed, and uneasy she was before she died. Yu struggled for a while, but due to the difference in strength, he could not push the corpse away. He was gradually out of breath. Mommy, he was extremely anxious. He was worried that Xianxia and Wuxia would meet with mishap during this time. He did not know how long the shooting would last. He also did not know how many bullets the killer hiding in the dark had. He only knew that the crowd in the square retreated like locusts and stepped on his hand from time to time. Yu curled up into a ball and used all his strength to push the corpse away. He stood up shakily. Yu suddenly could not hear anything in the midst of such a chaotic crowd. It was as if the line of death was stretched out in his ears. Beep, beep. He turned around and looked around again. He looked at every face that was filled with fear and uneasiness. From time to time, someone would fall and never stand up again. It was like purgatory on earth. He did not know why, but there was an inexplicable sense of guilt in his heart. She was dead, she was killed by a gunshot. Yu lowered his head to look at his hands. Clenching them tightly, he dashed into the crowd again. Mommy! Yu! Amidst the clamor, he suddenly heard a familiar voice. It was hysterical and almost cracked. It was her. It was Xianxia. Yu was agitated. He could no longer care about his demeanor. He pushed through the crowd and shouted loudly, Mommy! Where are you? His voice was drowned out again. Perhaps his voice did not reach her ears at all. However, at least he could be sure that she was still in the square, still in the crowd. Why was she still here? Chapter 36:14. No way, she must be looking for him. He had to find her as soon as possible and get her out of here. Yu shouted at the top of his lungs, Mommy! Mommy! I'm here. In the crowd, Xianxia and Wuxia were like headless flies, searching for Yu's voice. Vaguely, they heard a child shouting at the top of his lungs. Xianxia immediately stopped and listened carefully. Finally, she recognized that it was Yu's voice. She turned around and grabbed Wuxia's hand excitedly. She asked, Did you hear that? Wuxia nodded. Yeah, I heard it. I feel that Yu is nearby. He's still at the square. Xianxia was extremely touched. He's looking for us too. Wuxia tried to identify the voice again and pointed in a direction. The voice is coming from there. Hurry. We have to find him quickly. It's too dangerous. The two of them kept moving through the crowd with their fingers interlocked. Xianxia kept calling Yu's name. Yu, Mommy is here. At the same time, Yu followed the direction of Xianxia's voice. In the crowd, Wuxia used his height advantage and finally saw Yu. He immediately squeezed through the crowd and rushed towards Yu. Xianxia also saw him. She chased after him and hugged Yu tightly. Yu didn't see her, and before he could react, Yun Shirshir hugged him tightly. He looked up and saw that it was Yun Shirshir and Mu Yaja. The huge rock in his heart was finally lifted. "You're okay?" Yun Shirshir cried tears of joy. She hugged him with lingering fear. The embrace of surviving a disaster made her arms tremble. Just now, when the gunshot sounded, she immediately realized that there was danger. Mu Yaja said that someone had attacked the crowd. According to the direction of the gunshots, they vaguely came from the direction of the hotel. He guessed that someone was probably hiding in the hotel room, shooting at the crowd with a machine gun or an AK-47. Yun Shirshir and Mu Yaja were worried that something might have happened to Yu, so they kept looking in the direction where Yu had run. Along the way, Yun Shirshir was extremely worried. Now, the scene was chaotic. The crowd was rushing toward the exit, and gunshots were constantly heard. Among the panicked crowd, people could be seen falling to the ground and being trampled on until they spat out blood. It was not hard to see that in the midst of the pushing and shoving, some people had fallen in front of the railing, and their shoulders had been pierced by the sharp railing. It was too scary. When Yun Shirshir thought that Yu might have been in such danger, she was anxious. Thank goodness. Thank God. Yu was fine. Yun Shirshir hugged Yu tightly. At this moment, gunshots were heard again. She screamed in fear and covered Yu as they lay on the ground. Mu Yaja also used his body to protect the mother and son. Looking around, he saw that the crowd was retreating. This meant that the density of the crowd was decreasing, and the possibility of them being exposed to the killers was increasing. They were in danger of being shot at any time. When the gunshots stopped, Mu Yaja held Yun Shirshir's arm and said, "We can't stay here for long. Let's go." As he said that, he helped the mother and son up and ran in the direction of the crowd. Chapter 36:15. He was very tall. Even if a bullet was fired at him, he would be the first to be hit. Yun Shirshir and Yu would definitely be safe. It was almost instinctive for him to want to protect them from harm. Yun Shirshir was in a panic and did not notice Mu Yaja's special position. Yu, on the other hand, was very sensitive and noticed it immediately. Mu Yaja was protecting them. Yu suddenly felt a strange feeling in her heart. Touched? Guilty? Mixed feelings. "Let's go this way." Mu Yaja pulled Yun Shirshir's arm while Yun Shirshir protected Yu. The three of them ran towards the crowd. The police sirens were heard. The police cars and ambulances were alerted and rushed over. On the other side of the square, there was a big crowd on the street facing the road. Everyone had scattered here and left the square. This was a temporary safe zone. Yu saw many people either kneeling on the ground or lying on the ground. They were hugging their heads and crying. Many of them were injured. Although the injuries were not fatal, they had lost a lot of blood. Some of them were out of danger and immediately called their family and friends to tell them that they were safe. Some of them were crying as they talked on the phone. They had not recovered from the shock of surviving a disaster. Some couples were hugging each other. Some were hugging their injured friends and crying in fear. "Help! There are injured people here. Where's the doctor? Where's the nurse? Save me." There were many children in the crowd. They were so frightened by this sudden incident that they started crying. The parents kept comforting and hugging them. Yun Shirshir held Yu's hand and ran all the way here. She was exhausted. After making sure that they had arrived safely, she was so frightened that she fell to the ground. She did not have the energy to say another word. Mu Yaja also knelt on the ground. Yu looked at him and was shocked by the blood on his shoulder. Yu stared straight at him. She pointed at his shoulder and said, Your shoulder is covered in blood." When Yun Shirshir heard this, she turned around and looked at Mu Yaja. She was frightened by the blood-stained sleeve on his shoulder. She threw herself at him, looking helplessly at the blood-stained sleeve on his shoulder. She asked anxiously, "What happened?" "I'm fine. Don't worry. I was probably grazed by a bullet. Earlier, when he was running all the way here, he didn't realize that he was injured. He only knew that he had to leave this dangerous area as soon as possible, so he didn't realize that he was injured." Yun Shirshir did not know what to do, but Yu was the first to run over. He gently pushed Yun Shirshir away and said to Mu Yaja, "Sit down." He was too tall. He couldn't move. Mu Yaja disagreed. Don't worry. Sit down. Mu Yaja had no choice but to sit down. Yu Yu pinched the ends of his sleeve and tore it open forcefully. He heaved a sigh of relief when he saw the wound. He thought that he had been hit by a bullet. He looked at the wound. It was only grazed by a bullet and there was a lot of blood. He cleaned the wound a little, tore a piece of cloth from his shirt, and simply bandaged the wound. He pressed on it to stop the bleeding. Xianxia was stunned. Yu Yu knew why she was surprised. He explained, I've learned some basic bandaging and bleeding control. These were not difficult. If he was injured at a critical moment, the most important thing was to stop the bleeding. This was what Lisa had taught him. These were the most basic first aid techniques. Chapter 36:16. At first, he was not willing to learn, but Lisa forced him to learn. After all, he often went to war zones. If there was an accident, she could not be by his side to protect him. If he was injured, basic bleeding control could save his life. Mu Yaja saw Xianxia's worried expression and immediately comforted her. Don't worry, it's just a simple scratch. It's nothing serious. It's good that you're okay. Xianxia sat in front of him, still in a state of shock. She wiped away her tears and heaved a sigh of relief as she finally calmed down. The police arrived quickly. With the clues provided, they immediately sneaked into the hotel and checked the rooms one by one. Finally, the attacker in a room on the 15th floor was killed on the spot. When they entered the room, everyone was shocked. The room had become an armory. There were AK-47s, machine guns, pistols, and even grenades that were not thrown out in time. It was hard to imagine how terrifying the situation would be if grenades were thrown into such a dense crowd. At that time, the number of casualties would probably increase by several times. The specific reason for the attack would have to wait until the case was filed for investigation. However, this was probably the most violent social terrorist incident in a long time. In the huge square, there were countless casualties. Preliminary estimates put the number of casualties in the hundreds. In the past, there had never been such a bad public security incident. The law in the country strictly controlled firearms. It was illegal to carry a gun. Ordinary criminals did not have such channels to get their hands on guns. This attack had never happened before. Xianxia called Gong Jie. Gong Jie handed Yueyao to the nanny and drove over. However, the square was heavily congested with traffic. All the vehicles had to make way for the police cars and ambulances. There were more than 10 ambulances that were constantly transporting the injured. Cries, sobs, and screams were still incessant. Xianxia looked at the square through the railing. From afar, she could see that the ground was in a mess. Many light sticks were scattered on the ground, drink bottles, cans, and many corpses were scattered on the ground, as well as the wailing injured. It was hard to imagine that not long ago, this place was peaceful. Music, beer, light sticks, cheers, and screams. Now it had become hell on earth. Hundreds of corpses were piled on the ground, and blood flowed like a river. Xianxia had never seen such a scene before. She still felt that this was a complete nightmare. The scene was cordoned off and maintained. Yu Yu also stared blankly, unable to react for a long time. This accident, without the need for an official announcement, had already been defined as a bad shooting. How could this be? How could this be? The tragic cries still echoed in his ears. For the first time in her life, Yu Yu felt that weapons could bring about such a terrifying hell. They were considered lucky. If they weren't lucky enough, it would be him, or Mommy, or Muyat. Perhaps it was one of the corpses in the square. For the first time in his life, he hated guns. This was something that could only bring death. In her mind, she suddenly recalled the words he had said in the past. I want all the wars in this world to end because of me, and to be born because of me. But what was before them was war. However, after experiencing death for themselves, perhaps only then did they realize how terrifying death and war were. Chapter 36:17. Gong Jie finally arrived at the scene. When Xianxia saw him, she walked over and said to Gong Jie, Shao Jie, your brother-in-law is injured. Hurry up and send him to the hospital. What's going on? Gong Jie did not know what had happened. When he arrived, he saw Yu Yu standing alone at the side, looking at the cordoned-off square. Her back view looked lonely and bleak. Yun Shirshir was guarding Muyazha. Not long ago, someone was shooting at the square with a gun. There were many casualties. Gong Jie questioned, "Where's the ambulance?" "I saw many ambulances coming here." Yun Shirshir shook her head and said, "There are too many injured people. Those who are seriously injured take priority." Muyazha was only grazed, so the ambulance only bandaged him. Yun Shirshir was extremely anxious. Even though Muyazha kept comforting her, saying that it was just a small injury and that it was not a big deal. But she was very anxious. Gong Jie checked Muyazha's injury. It was indeed a small injury. Once the bleeding stopped, it would not be a big deal. A graze from a bullet would not leave any scars. He also said, "Shirshir, don't worry too much. I've taken a look. It's really a small injury." Seeing that Gong Jie also said so, Yun Shirshir was relieved. When Muyazha said that it was a small injury, she thought that he was afraid that she would be worried and comforted her, so he said that. Gong Jie understood the situation and was a little surprised when he found out what had just happened. The security in Beijing is very good. Why would there be a shooting incident for no reason? Yun Shirshir was also confused. Yu suddenly turned around and said coldly, "It's probably to take revenge on society." When Gong Jie heard this, he did not say much. He only said, "Get in the car. Even if it's just a minor injury, it still needs to be treated as soon as possible." Muyazha nodded and stood up. He said to Gong Jie, "Don't go to the big hospital in the city center. There are a lot of injured people there. With this wound, any hospital will do." All right. The three of them got into the car, and Gong Jie drove them to a relatively remote area. They randomly found a medium-sized hospital. The way in was very congested, but the way out was much wider. The ambulance prioritized sending the injured to the nearest hospital. Therefore, the few big hospitals near the city center were all overcrowded. In comparison, although this hospital was a little out of the way, it was fortunate that there were not many people. Soon, the queue was filled. While Muyazha was treating his wounds, Yu bumped into Gu Jinglian again in the corridor. Who would have thought that the two of them would be so fated to be admitted to the same hospital? Gu Jinglian was not injured. The one who was injured was Lin Shi. When he was leaving with the crowd, he got a small cut on his arm by a fallen railing. He needed a few stitches. When the two of them met again, Gu Jinglian did not expect that Yu would be safe and sound. When he saw Yu running against the crowd to the center of the square, he thought that he must have been killed. Even if he could dodge the bullets, he would not be able to dodge the crowd. He was afraid that he would suddenly fall and be trampled by the crowd. There were so many injured people. Some of them were shot by the bullets, while most of them were trampled by the crowd when they fell. Some of them were not injured, but many of them were trampled to death when they fell in the crowd. When Gu Jinglian saw Yun Shirshir sitting behind Yu, he immediately understood why he was in such a hurry to come back. He was looking for someone. Chapter 36:18. He did not expect the cold and heartless child to have such a soft side. Gu Jinglian was a little surprised. When Yu saw Gu Jinglian, he lowered his head and did not say anything. Gu Jinglian crossed his arms. "Why, don't you recognize me?" When Yun Shirshir heard the voice, she looked up and saw Gu Jinglian. Her eyes widened in surprise. She recognized him. Gu Jinglian, the head of the Gu family in Beijing. He was also Gu Xingzi's elder brother. Why was he here? Yu suddenly stood up and walked in front of him. He said coldly, "If there's anything, don't talk about it here." With that said, he tugged at his sleeve and led him to a corner. When he turned around, Yu's gaze was filled with hostility. "Gu Jinglian, what exactly is it that you're haunting me like a ghost?" Gu Jinglian crossed his arms in front of his chest calmly. "What do I have to do with you, Gong Fan? We haven't settled the score between us yet." "What score?" "The matter in North Africa is not something that can be forgotten so easily." Gu Jinglian said expressionlessly, "Werther is the core of the Gu family in North Africa. You used those despicable methods to take it away from me. How are we going to settle this score?" "Despicable? You did not think much of it." He said faintly, "Gu Jinglian, don't make yourself sound so noble. I don't need to mention how you got that piece of land in Werther, right? That piece of land in Werther used to belong to Hurricane. In order to get that piece of land, the Gu family did not necessarily use honorable methods. Now, he was saying that he was despicable? So what? He only looked at the results and did not ask about the process. Gu Jinglian sized him up silently. Suddenly, he squatted in front of him and said slowly, I have to say, you're really impressive to have such skills at such a young age. However, I did lose the matter in North Africa. I have no objections. However, I hope that you won't go against me in the future. He paused for a moment and said with some difficulty, After all, you're just a child. If I'm too harsh on you, I'll be going too far. The boy's lips curled into a smile when he heard that. I also hope that you won't go against me. Otherwise, I will also feel very embarrassed to have you suffer so much. The two of them had similar auras, so it was difficult to determine who was superior. Gu Jinglian's thin lips twitched slightly. The capital city had always been a place of strife, and there had never been a lack of open and veiled struggles. However, since Mu Yaja married Xianxia, withdrew from the strife, and focused on his family, the Xinyu financial group's aggressive expansion had also been restrained a little. Without such a strong opponent, Gu Jinglian could not help but feel bored. Still, with a powerful up-and-coming talent like Yun Tianyu around, it would not be too boring for her. Gu Jinglian stood up, touched his head provocatively and turned to leave. Yu Yu watched his back coldly and returned to Yun Shirshi's side. At this time, Mu Yaja's wound had been treated. Seeing him appear out of nowhere, he asked suspiciously, Where did you go just now? Yu Yu turned his face away and did not say a word. It was as if he had returned to the day when he had just returned to the Mu family and locked himself in his own world, as if he was isolated from the world. Mu Yaja was stunned, but he smiled. He understood his son's character. He was arrogant, sharp-tongued, and insincere. Chapter 36:19. He heard Yu Yu calling him Daddy. He heard Yu Yu calling him Daddy. His heart was burning with anxiety. That was enough. At least it proved that his Yu Yu had never left. Mu Yaja suddenly hugged Yu Yu from behind and lifted him up. Yun Shirsher saw this and couldn't help but say angrily, You're injured and you're still so restless. However, Mu Yaja said, It's nothing. It's just a small injury. He bent down and gently kissed Yu Yu's forehead. Yu Yu's face instantly heated up. He turned his face away awkwardly to avoid him. With an unnatural expression, he said, What are you doing? Carrying my son. Mu Yaja saw that Yu Yu was blushing adorably. He lowered his voice and whispered in his ear, Just now at the square, you were so anxious to call me Daddy. Now you're acting as if you don't care. You're still the same as before, saying one thing and meaning another. Yu Yu looked even more uncomfortable. He struggled and said, Let go of me. As he struggled slightly, Mu Yaja's face showed a hint of pain. Ouch, it hurts. Yu Yu was nervous for a moment. He thought that his struggle had affected his wound. For a moment, he didn't dare to move. Mu Yaja saw this and snickered in his heart. Beside him, Yun Shirsher and Gong Jie looked at each other and snickered in their hearts. This proved that Yu Yu was still the same as before. Although he was awkward, he still knew how to care for others. On the island, the sea breeze danced. Mu Yichen suddenly woke up from his nightmare. Outside the window, the sun was already shining brightly. It was a dream. He held his forehead with a headache. When he woke up just now, he had completely forgotten the contents of his dream. He only knew that in his dream, he seemed to be very sad and upset. He seemed to have dreamt of Yu Yu. Half a month had passed since she swapped identities with Yu Yu. However, he was still not used to everything on the island. Boredom, loneliness, solitude, desolation. Sometimes, when Lisa was around, there was a companion. Although Lisa wasn't good with words and didn't like to talk, she didn't dare to start a conversation with Xiao Yichen. She always acted indifferent. However, regardless of whether she liked to talk or not, at least she had someone to keep her company. When Lisa was not around, Xiao Yichen had developed the ability to communicate with objects. Sometimes, he would talk to himself while walking. Ask and answer questions to yourself. If he didn't do that, he wouldn't know how to prove that he was still alive. Apart from breathing, thinking, and talking, Xiao Yichen felt like he was about to go crazy from boredom on this island. Lisa secretly gave him a tablet. With the tablet, when Xiao Yichen was bored, he would play games on the tablet to pass the time. He downloaded a pet training game called Pet Manor. In the game, he could adopt pets, build a pet manor, raise pets, and even talk to them. After training, the pets could even understand his commands and respond accordingly. He had a French bulldog named Yu and a ragdoll cat named Lisa. One day, Xiao Yichen held the tablet and talked to Yu. "Lie down." On the screen, the cream-colored French bulldog lay down obediently. It stuck out its tongue and tilted its head to look at him. Xiao Yichen rubbed its round head and barked again, "Yu." The bulldog barked in joy. Chapter 36:20. The bulldog barked in joy. Woof. What's 1 plus 1? The bulldog hesitated for a few seconds and barked a few times. Xiao Yichen continued, "What's 3 plus 9 to 4 plus 15 to 80 plus 2? The bulldog was stunned and looked at him in confusion. Xiao Yichen was amused and laughed out loud. "Look, you don't even know how to add and subtract such simple numbers. You always say that I'm an idiot, but I think you're the idiot. Idiot Yu." The bulldog understood the word, idiot, and lay on the ground weakly, revealing an innocent and pitiful expression. The ragdoll cat, Lisa, walked past Yu gracefully and curled up into a ball in the cat bed. Xiao Yichen said again, "Lisa, come here." The ragdoll cat licked her paws and turned her head lazily to look at him. However, she seemed indifferent and ignored him. Xiao Yichen said unhappily, "Lisa, come here. Be good and listen to me." Only then did the ragdoll walk gracefully to the screen and sit beside Yu, with a noble and inviolable look on her face. Xiao Yichen said, "Lie down." Meow. Lisa meowed lazily but did not move. In this game, cats were the hardest to tame. Cats were arrogant, cold, clingy, indifferent, affectionate, and distant. They were especially hard to tame. So far, Xiao Yichen had only learned one trick. Scratch him. Upon hearing this, Lisa turned around and swiped her claws at Yu. She was shockingly fierce. Haha. Xiao Yichen was amused by this scene and laughed until he was rocking back and forth. When he looked up, he saw the real Lisa's cold face. Xiao Yichen was scared out of his wits. He froze and did not dare to move. Lisa put the tablet on the table and asked in a neutral tone, "Is it fun?" "It's okay." He scratched his face. "Yeah, it's just to pass the time." "Is this game very fun?" Xiao Yichen said awkwardly, "It's okay, I guess." Lisa glanced at him expressionlessly and her gaze fell on the screen. That noble ragdoll cat. At least he knew what was good for him. She was set to be a ragdoll cat. If she was set to be a dog, she would scratch him. Xiao Yichen complained, "It's so boring to be alone in the castle. There's no one to play with me." "Are you still a 3-year-old child? Do you still need someone to play with you?" "Although I'm not a 3-year-old, I'm still a kid." Xiao Yichen tugged at Lisa's sleeve and begged, "Lisa, play with me, okay? Let's go pick up seashells and make wind chimes. Gong Xiaoying will be here tomorrow." Lisa suddenly said. Xiao Yichen's expression froze. He stared at Lisa in astonishment and said suspiciously, "Didn't you say that Gong Xiaoying usually doesn't come here? That's under normal circumstances." Lisa continued, "You haven't left the island for a long time and there hasn't been any news from you. Of course, Gong Xiaoying will come and check on you. You have to remember that no matter what, you can't give yourself away when Gong Xiaoying comes tomorrow." "What will happen if I give myself away?" Xiao Yichen thought to himself, "This Gong Xiaoying is my grandfather after all. Even if I give myself away, he won't say that he will slit my neck with a knife, right?" Lisa said, "If my identity is exposed, I will die." Xiao Yichen was speechless. Chapter 36:21. Xiao Yichen was shocked. Would Lisa be in trouble if his identity was exposed? Gong Xiaoying was so cruel. It seemed like his grandfather was not cute at all. Xiao Yichen felt wronged and said, "I'm innocent. I don't care." Lisa grabbed him by the collar and said coldly, "So I'm warning you, if you expose yourself, I won't let you off." Then, How can I not expose myself? Xiao Yichen spread his hands and said, You and I talk like each other, how can he recognize us? It's fine if you don't talk, but once you do, you expose your IQ. After a pause, Lisa continued, How can a leader who founded the Hurricane Group be so stupid? Besides, do you think he doesn't know that your mommy gave birth to twins? Not only does he know, but he also knows the biggest difference between you and Yu. Yes, she admitted. Yu and Xiao Yichen really looked alike. However, this did not mean that they would not be exposed in front of a sly old fox like Gong Xiaoying. Xiao Yichen was curious and asked, What's the difference? Lisa said coldly, One is talkative, the other is quiet. He was caught off guard. Xiao Yichen felt wronged. He did not think that he was a talkative person. Why did everyone say that he was talkative? Anyway, when he comes, you should talk less, eat less, and make less facial expressions. Xiao Yichen did not understand. I can understand if you want me to talk less and make less facial expressions, but why should I eat less? Lisa said expressionlessly, Yu eats very little, he doesn't eat as much as you. Usually he only eats a few meals, but you ate 3 big bowls at once. It would be strange if he didn't suspect anything. Xiao Yichen felt that what she said made sense. All right, he won't be here for long anyway. Although he won't be here for long, you can't let your guard down. Understand? Xiao Yichen saluted and said lazily, Yes, sir. Isn't it just eating less, talking less, and making fewer expressions? I might as well lock myself in my room. Lisa raised her chin and said, In fact, Yu has always been like this. He rarely leaves his room, so when he comes, you better stay in your room and don't go anywhere, okay? Got it. The next day, Xiao Yichen woke up early and ate 2 big bowls of rice before Gong Xiaoying arrived. However, by noon, Gong Xiaoying was still nowhere to be seen. Could it be that he wasn't coming? Xiao Yichen thought excitedly that it would be best if she didn't come. It would save him the trouble of pretending to be Yu. In the afternoon, while he was taking an afternoon nap, he vaguely heard the sound of the door closing. Then he heard Lisa and Alice's voices. Xiao Yichen turned over and squinted his eyes. Lisa, is he here? Master, young Master Fan is still taking an afternoon nap. Lisa didn't answer him immediately but said this instead. Xiao Yichen frowned and opened one of his eyes. However, he was surprised to see that the bed was surrounded by a crowd. He sat up in surprise, only to see Liza and Alice staring at him nervously and giving him meaningful looks. Xiao Yichen snapped out of his daze and glanced at the other side of the bed. He saw a man in his 50s standing in front of the window. He was wearing a suit and a military-style waistcoat. He was tall and handsome, but when he looked at him, his aura was intimidating. Chapter 36:22. He recognized that this man with a strong aura was Gong Xiaoying. His grandfather. Little Yichen immediately retracted his expression and put on an extremely cold expression as he stared at him in a daze. Gong Xiaoying looked at him and then at Alice. How's his condition? Alice immediately replied, He's almost recovered. After a year of recuperation, the functions of his organs are basically the same as a healthy person's. Xiao Yichen lowered his head silently. His cold expression was no different from Yu's. Lisa's heart finally settled down. Gong Xiaoying came too suddenly. She had originally thought that something had happened at the last minute, so she canceled her trip and wouldn't be coming. She didn't expect Gong Xiaoying to come so suddenly. She wasn't mentally prepared for it. Xiao Yichen was taking an afternoon nap, so Gong Xiaoying asked to see Xiao Yichen. She was worried that Xiao Yichen would be in a daze and wouldn't be able to react in time, so she told him that he was resting. However, Gong Xiaoying insisted on seeing him. She couldn't stop him, so she led him into the room uneasily. Fortunately, Xiao Yichen reacted quickly. Even though he had just woken up and was confused, he wasn't so muddle-headed that he would give himself away. Gong Xiaoying sat down on the side of the bed and said slowly, Why didn't you call me? Xiao Yichen looked up at him, but his mind skipped a beat. Lisa didn't mention how Yu usually addressed Gong Xiaoying. Old master? Or grandfather? Lisa hurriedly said, Young Master Fan hasn't woken up yet. Gong Xiaoying laughed when he heard that. Even if he's still asleep, he can't have forgotten how to address me, right? Xiao Yichen's heart suddenly felt uneasy. In the Gong family, etiquette was very important. When a junior met a senior, they would greet them. This was etiquette. Gong Xiaoying valued etiquette. Even the arrogant Gong Jie would have to greet his elders respectfully when he returned to Gong Xiaoying. There was a clear distinction between seniority and inferiority. Xiao Yichen glanced at Lisa and noticed that she was clenching her fists nervously. For a moment he also felt uneasy. "Outer," he called out tentatively while cautiously looking at Lisa to observe her expression. Seeing that Lisa did not express any strange attitude, he knew that calling him Grandpa was the right thing to do. "Grandfather," he called out in a low voice. Gong Xiaoying smiled in satisfaction. He patted his head and asked gently, "Are you still asleep?" Xiao Yichen lowered his head and nodded lightly. Gong Xiaoying smiled and said, "Sleep a little longer." When Xiao Yichen heard that, he felt as if he had been granted amnesty and fell straight onto the bed. He wished that he could avoid having to deal with Gong Xiaoying. It was simply a blessing that he could continue sleeping. This way, he would not have to rack his brains to think of a way to not expose himself. Gong Xiaoying lowered his body and covered him with the blanket. Then, he stood up and walked out of the room. Before Lisa left, she whispered in his ear, "Yu is very respectful to old master. You must not give yourself away." Lisa then left with a peace of mind. Xiao Yichen lay in bed until nighttime. When it was dinner time, he could no longer escape. Xiao Yichen then left the room and walked into the dining room. At that moment, everyone was seated at the table, including Gong Xiaoying. Chapter 36-23. However, he pretended to be calm as he walked to the table and sat down. He picked up his cutlery and buried his head in his food. Gong Xiaoying suddenly put down his cutlery and asked, "Some time ago, you took over Werther's piece of land. I didn't expect you to be able to take it back from Gu Jinglian. You're not simple." Xiao Yichen was stunned but didn't say anything. Gong Xiaoying continued, "The factories on that piece of land will probably all be leveled soon. When do you plan to carry out the experiment that you came up with?" Xiao Yichen was speechless. Experiment? What was an experiment? What was Werther? Gong Xiaoying said a bunch of terms that he didn't understand. How could he possibly answer this? How was he supposed to answer? Didn't they say that it would be fine as long as he ate less, spoke less, and made fewer expressions? How was he supposed to answer such a difficult question? Xiao Yichen looked up blankly and looked at Lisa. However, he saw that she was holding her forehead and looked like she was having a headache. She also didn't expect that Gong Xiaoying would come this time to discuss the issue of the North African experimental base with her. Xiao Yichen was speechless as he cut a piece of steak. He took a bite and swallowed it with difficulty. Seeing that Gong Xiaoying was staring at him, he elegantly wiped his mouth with a wet towel and said calmly, "I don't have any leads yet." Gong Xiaoying was speechless. Lisa was speechless. Alice choked on her dry red wine. Gong Xiaoying said suspiciously, "You are the one who suggested this experimental base. How can you say that you don't have any leads?" Xiao Yichen's expression didn't change, but his back kept breaking out in cold sweat. Alice was worried that the matter would be exposed and quickly poked her head with her finger. When Xiao Yichen saw this, he instantly realized that Alice must be hinting at something. But what did she mean by poking her head? Xiao Yichen also poked his own head and suddenly said, "Is there something wrong with your head?" Alice raised her head in shock and stared at him in horror. Lisa's eyes were wide open. She did not expect Xiao Yichen's comprehension ability to be so terrible. Gong Xiaoying was also stunned. What? What did he mean by there was something wrong with his brain? Alice face-palmed, looking like she was having a headache. When Xiao Yichen saw this, he finally understood what she meant. He held his forehead and pretended to have a headache. Lisa immediately stood up and pretended to be worried as she walked over to his side and held his shoulder. "Young Master Fan, does your head hurt again?" "It hurts." Xiao Yichen pretended to be patient and took a deep breath. "My head hurts." Lisa immediately looked at Alice worriedly. The latter also reacted. "Is it a reaction to the drug?" Gong Xiaoying looked at them suspiciously. Alice explained, Some drugs will have a backlash effect and some strong side effects. It will stimulate the central nervous system of the brain and cause headaches. She was talking nonsense with a straight face, but Gong Xiaoying actually believed her. Alice and Lisa immediately helped Xiao Yichen up the stairs. When they were halfway up the stairs, Alice could not wait to take him away. She almost carried him away. When they reached the room, Alice asked her assistant to stand guard outside the door while she and Lisa dragged Xiao Yichen into the room. Xiao Yichen turned around and said, "Didn't I tell you not to talk so much?" He asked me such a complicated question. How am I supposed to answer him? Lisa also had a headache and said, "Master is probably here because of the North African experimental base." North African? Experimental base? Experimental base? Chapter 36-24. Xiao Yichen suddenly felt a headache coming on. I don't even know what the experimental base he's talking about is. Lisa explained, not long ago, Yu bought a piece of land in North Africa. He wanted to make use of the favorable environment there to develop an electromagnetic experimental base. Alice suddenly interrupted her. Lisa, he's been here for so long. Don't tell me you haven't even told him about something as important as the Heavenly Eye Project? Lisa didn't know what to say for a moment. Xiao Yichen was even more confused. What's the Heavenly Eye Project? Alice sat down and immediately began to educate him. The Heavenly Eye Project is a concept proposed by Yu. Through the research and development of quantum technology, they will create a Skynet that can cover the entire world's information network. Through this Skynet, missiles can be intercepted at any time, and any missile launch can be interrupted. In other words, if the Heavenly Eye Project is successfully developed, Hurricane Group will become the overlord of the world. Xiao Yichen was stunned. Alice was simple and precise. In short, if the Heavenly Eye Project is successfully developed, it can create and stop all wars. Xiao Yichen finally understood. So, if this project is successfully developed, Hurricane Group will completely control the world? Lisa and Alice looked at each other with gratification. They nodded and said in unison, "You can say that." Alice, in particular, did not understand. Xiao Yichen and Yu were twins. They were both born in the same womb, but why was Yu so crazy and Xiao Yichen so stupid? One proposed the idea of the Heavenly Eye Project, while the other had to explain what the Heavenly Eye Project was for a long time before he could understand it. She really wondered what their genetic makeup was like. Xiao Yichen said, "This question is too complicated. If he asks this again, I'll definitely give myself away." Even though he knew, if Gong Xiaoying really asked him about the Heavenly Eye Project, he still wouldn't know a thing. What should we do? Lisa and Alice sighed. Alice, did Master say that he'll be on the island for a few days? Alice shook her head. That means you don't know when he'll leave? Xiao Yichen said impatiently. Even if our identities are exposed, it doesn't matter. Yu doesn't belong to him. Why is he controlling Yu and using him to monopolize the world's rules? He's our grandfather, how can he use Yu like this? If of course Mommy, this would be sad. Before this, he had always thought that Gong Xiaoying had erased Yu's memory and kept him in the Gong family because he loved Yu and missed Xianxia. That was why he wanted to keep him by his side. But now, it seemed that Gong Xiaoying's intentions were not that simple. Could it be that he wanted to use Yu to achieve his position as the king of Hurricane? That was too selfish. How painful was Yu? How painful was Mommy? How painful was Daddy? Could it be that the feelings of so many people were not as important as his ambition? Could it be that his hatred for the Mu family was so deep that he couldn't let go of it? Chapter 36-25. Lisa pulled him back nervously and warned, "Keep your voice down. What if old Master hears you?" Xiao Yichen couldn't hide the gloom in his eyes. He stared at Lisa and said word by word, "So what if he hears you? If your identity is exposed, Yu will also be in trouble. Why? Why should Yu and my fate be in his hands? I admit that Hurricane Group is very powerful, but Gong Xiaoying can't be so arrogant as to cover the sky with one hand, right?" Xiao Yichen said in a low voice, In any case, I won't acknowledge this grandpa, and I won't call him that again. Lisa and Alice looked at each other with gloomy expressions. Xiao Yichen, calm down. Mu Yichen turned around expressionlessly with a frosty expression on his face. Lisa said, it's best not to let Gong Xiaoying find out that you and Yu have swapped identities. He didn't keep Yu by his side purely to make use of him. Besides dealing with Xingyu. Before she could finish speaking, Xiao Yichen suddenly interrupted her. What did you say? Lisa knew that she had spilled the beans and immediately shut her mouth tightly. Xiao Yichen's eyes were bloodshot. He grabbed Lisa's collar and asked coldly, deal with Xingyu? Tell me, what other motives does Gong Xiaoying have? He used Yu to design the Heavenly Eye plan, and he actually wants to use Yu to deal with Xingyu. Alice immediately stopped Xiao Yichen and pulled the two of them apart. Both of you calm down. How can I calm down? Xiao Yichen said sternly, my biological grandfather is using my brother to deal with my father. How can I calm down? Alice took a deep breath and sighed. Because he always thought that it was the Mu family who took everything away from him. Therefore, he did everything he could to destroy the Mu family and Xingyu. If Yu were still in Hurricane Group, the next step of the plan would have been to focus fire on Xingyu. Mu Yichen cried out, is he crazy? What benefits does he get from doing this? If Mommy finds out, she won't forgive him at all. When the time comes, if Xingyu declares bankruptcy and the Mu family, even if the Mu and Xingyu's mommies, I will still be by Daddy's side. He paused for a moment before continuing. Even if the Mu family has nothing left, be it Mommy, me, or Yu, we won't leave the Mu family. We won't go anywhere. Bang. The Xingyu's the loud noise startled the three people in the room. Lisa and Alice were stunned. They turned their heads and saw a tall figure outside the open door. It was incomparably clear in their eyes. Xiao Yichen turned around expressionlessly and saw Gong Xiaoying slowly striding in. Behind him, a row of tall guards followed closely behind him like stars surrounding the moon. Gong Xiaoying walked in and glanced at Xiao Yichen with his eagle eyes. He said coldly, what a good, not going anywhere. It looks like your family of four is really loving. You're wrong. It's not a family of four, it's a family of five. Gong Xiaoying was surprised when he heard this. What? Chapter 36-26. Gong Xiaoying's pupils constricted, but he soon broke into a smile. He calmed down and sized up Xiao Yichen. His words were sharp. You're Mu Yichen? Mu Yichen did not reply to him. He only glared at him coldly, clearly regarding him as an enemy. His eyes were full of hostility. Gong Xiaoying's eyes narrowed slightly. Why is he here? Where's Gong Fan? Didn't I ask you to guard him? Right from the start, he was acutely aware of the differences between Xiao Yichen and Yu. Even though Xiao Yichen was deliberately imitating Yu, be it his expression, tone, or style of doing things, it was hard not to leave traces behind. Xiao Yichen was Xiao Yichen. Yu was Yu. Both of them were unique, and no one could imitate them. Gong Xiaoying discovered the clues at one glance. At the dining table, he deliberately probed Xiao Yichen, who was caught off guard, and finally gave himself away. He was shocked, but he did not show it on his face. It was only when Xiao Yichen went upstairs that he followed him in puzzlement. Separated by a door, he could vaguely guess the whole story. The two children had been swapped. Yu was no longer on this island, and the person in front of him was not Yu but Mu Yichen. Gong Xiaoying did not expect things to turn out this way. He was extremely shocked. Xiao Yichen said expressionlessly, Yu has a name. He's called Yun Tianyu, not Gong Fan. Yu doesn't care about the lousy name you gave him. The real Yu will only recognize the name Mommy gave him. Lisa saw the drastic change in his expression and immediately stood in front of Xiao Yichen protectively. She said nervously, Master, I'm sorry. Did they switch? Gong Xiaoying raised his hand and ruthlessly slapped him across the face. Lisa was slapped in the face. Her body shook violently, but she did not fall down. She clenched her fists, raised her head, and said through gritted teeth, Master, I'm sorry. Gong Xiaoying bellowed, No buts. It was another vicious slap to the face. Lisa finally lost her balance and fell to the ground. She covered her burning cheeks, but immediately stood up. Without saying a word, she was ready to accept Gong Xiaoying's punishment. "Master, I'm sorry." Gong Xiaoying raised his hand again and slapped her cheek. Lisa calmly closed her eyes, but after a long time, the slap did not land. She opened her eyes in surprise, only to see Xiao Yichen holding Gong Xiaoying's wrist tightly. Gong Xiaoying was so strong, but under his grip, he did not move an inch. "You're not allowed to hit her," Xiao Yichen said coldly. "This has nothing to do with her. It's my idea." Gong Xiaoying sized him up coldly. "Your idea?" He did not believe that this child was smart enough to come up with such a plan to switch identities. Gong Xiaoying's bewildered gaze landed on Alice, and the latter took a step back in shock. Gong Xiaoying's sinister gaze was like an eagle's beak, making one tremble in fear. "Lock them up." At Gong Xiaoying's command, the bodyguards behind him rushed towards Alice and Lisa. One of the men had just grabbed Alice's arm when Xiao Yichen leaped up and delivered a flying kick to the man's elbow. Chapter 36:27. The back of his head hit the ground. The strong impact was like a magnitude 10 earthquake. No matter how iron-blooded a man was, he couldn't bear such intense pain and cried out in pain. Xiao Yichen kicked him a few meters away and shouted, "Who dares to touch them? Whose hand did I break?" Gong Xiaoying snorted. "You think you can go against Hurricane? You're overestimating yourself." Xiao Yichen laughed coldly. "Yes, I'm overestimating myself. Indeed, I'm just a child. I can't do anything to Hurricane." He laughed evilly. "Will you kill me? In other words, unless you kill me, I won't let you touch the people I want to protect." Gong Xiaoying was stunned. He didn't expect a child to ask such a question and have such willpower. His words were a threat, a provocation, contempt, and disdain. Indeed, no matter what, he wouldn't lay his hands on his own grandson. Even if Xiao Yichen looked down on him and disdained him, the two of them were connected by blood. However, Gong Xiaoying wouldn't allow anyone to challenge his authority. "Take them down and lock them up." Just as Gong Xiaoying finished speaking, more than 10 mercenaries behind him rushed forward and surrounded Alice and Lisa. He didn't believe that Xiao Yichen could defeat so many of his men. Xiao Yichen looked coldly at Gong Xiaoying and stood in front of Lisa to protect her. Lisa immediately pushed him away forcefully. "Don't worry about me. I didn't fulfill my responsibility. This is the punishment I deserve. I'll take responsibility for my own actions. I was the one who swapped you. Even if I was wrong, it's my fault. It has nothing to do with you." Lisa stared at him in disbelief. She lowered her voice and questioned him. "Xiao Yichen, what are you thinking? Do you really want to make him your enemy?" Xiao Yichen said expressionlessly, "From the moment he used Yu, he was already my enemy. I don't want to acknowledge him as my grandfather anymore. No matter what, he can forget about using Yu to destroy the Mu family. Lisa, you have to remember that he's not your master. Yu is... Have you forgotten? Your Gongjie is Yu's personal bodyguard. Only Yu has the right to decide your life and death. No one else." When Lisa heard this, she didn't know why, but her heart suddenly trembled. "This man is my enemy and Yu's enemy. Since he's Yu's enemy, he's also your enemy. What right do you have to listen to him? If it were me, I wouldn't listen to him obediently." Gong Xiaoying finally couldn't take it anymore. Grandfather and grandson had turned against each other. He had never thought that his biological grandson would make him his enemy. His heart ached. It was hard to imagine that things would turn out this way. Instantly, he flew into a rage out of humiliation and said bitterly, "Take him down too. Lock him up." The mercenaries pounced on Xiao Yichen. Before he could react, Lisa, who was behind him, pushed him away. She reached out and gripped the man's hand tightly. With a sudden twist, she broke the man's elbow. The mercenaries surrounded them from all directions. Lisa and Xiao Yichen stood back to back as they dealt with the incoming mercenaries and bodyguards. Their teamwork was flawless. Chapter 36:28. Gong Xiaoying did not expect a child's ability to be so terrifying. Xiao Yichen and Lisa had their backs to each other in tacit understanding. Facing the enemies coming at them from all directions, they threw punches, hooked kicks, and sent flying kicks. Their coordination was amazing and flawless. An adult weighing more than 100 kilograms was sent flying by Xiao Yichen, who was not even 10 years old. He was sent flying. What kind of terrifying leg strength did he have to be able to send an adult flying so far with just one kick? Gong Xiaoying retreated half a step in shock. At that moment, he saw Xiao Yichen grab a man by the collar and throw him harshly against a cabinet. With a loud thud, the cabinet fell to the ground. Under Lisa's cover, Xiao Yichen rushed to Gong Xiaoying and grabbed him by the collar. He coldly ordered, "Prepare a boat for me. I want to leave this place." "Don't even think of leaving unless you return Gong Fan." Mu Yichen sneered. "I don't know who Gong Fan is. I only have a younger brother, and his name is Yun Tianyu. Unless you kill me." Gong Xiaoying arrogantly raised his chin and enunciated each word clearly. "Otherwise, don't even think of leaving this place." Mu Yichen narrowed his eyes. At this moment, countless armed mercenaries rushed over from behind. There were hundreds of bodyguards stationed on the castle. When they saw this scene, they thought that it was Mu Yichen who had kidnapped Gong Xiaoying. They were so shocked that they immediately raised their guns and aimed at Mu Yichen. Lisa saw this and rushed over to protect Mu Yichen. "Don't shoot. This is Master's grandson. Don't shoot." The mercenaries did not put away their guns, though. They only listened to Gong Xiaoying's orders. Therefore, they did not listen to anyone else's words. Gong Xiaoying was very calm and coldly ordered, "Put away your guns." Only then did the mercenaries put away their guns. Gong Xiaoying lowered his head and exchanged glances with Mu Yichen. He warned, "Give up. I can't leave here." "Then let me give you a kind warning. It's impossible for you to use Yu to go against Xingyu Financial Group and my daddy. Our family of 5 will never be separated. I can brainwash him, but I can also erase your memory. I'm warning you, if you dare to leave this place, I will erase your memory, just like Gong Fan." "I told you he's not Gong Fan." Mu Yichen was so angry that he laughed. "If you're such a person who likes to force your will on others, who likes to manipulate the fate of others, then you don't deserve to be my grandfather, and you don't deserve to be my grandfather. You don't deserve my mommy to acknowledge you as her father." Mu Yichen glared at her. Lisa, who was watching from the side, was stunned. Only then did Gong Xiaoying react and look at his palm. Just now, when he lost control of his emotions, it was this hand that slapped him hard in the face. He hit him. He had used this hand to hit his own grandson. However, for some reason, when he heard Mu Yichen's hysterical words, he completely lost control. Yun Shishir was the pain he could not bring up. After being left outside for so many years, she was now unwilling to acknowledge him as her father for the sake of that brat from the Mu family. What he couldn't understand was why things had escalated to the point where he had become enemies with his own grandson. He had never thought that the situation would come to this. How did it come to this? "You're my grandson." Chapter 36:29. "Now, I want to leave this place. Whoever dares to stop me, don't blame me for being rude." As Mu Yichen spoke, he walked towards the door. Everyone was armed to the teeth and on high alert. They all raised their guns and were ready to fight. Lisa saw this and was worried. She immediately followed Mu Yichen out of the door. "Lisa!" Gong Xiaoying turned around angrily and said coldly, "Even you want to betray me?" Lisa's back stiffened, but she did not dare to turn around and look into his eyes. He turned around and said coldly, "Fine. Then I'll warn all of you. Unless I'm dead, none of you will be leaving this place." Mu Yichen stopped in his tracks but did not turn around. He raised his chin. Although his voice was not loud, it was powerful. "Unless you kill me, no one will be able to stop me." He had inherited Mu Yaja's arrogance. That small back view made Gong Xiaoying feel as though he was looking at Mu Yaja. He was completely enraged and clenched his fists tightly. Both of them were equally insufferably arrogant. One big and one small, they formed 2 terrifying energy fields. Mu Yichen had only taken a few steps when he suddenly felt a strange piercing pain in his back. He turned around in shock and saw a mercenary pointing a gun at him. He touched the place where the pain was coming from and felt a sticky trace of semen. What is this? Mu Yichen pursed his lips and looked coldly at Gong Xiaoying. He saw disappointment and indifference in his eyes. His heart had turned completely cold. However, he was not afraid at all. Even if he died, he wanted to leave this place. Mu Yichen's body swayed. He turned around and walked towards the door again. Gong Xiaoying was so stunned that he almost suffocated. Even so, this child did not beg him for anything. Where was he going? Did he really think that he could leave this isolated island just by walking out of this door? Even if he died, he wanted to return to that man's side. Mu Yichen's body swayed slightly as though he was about to fall. He struggled to hold onto the wall and slowly walked towards the door. A strong sense of dizziness engulfed him. His forehead was covered with cold sweat and he looked like he would faint in the next second. Gong Xiaoying looked at his stubborn expression and felt both pain and disappointment. Shoot! Lisa was so shocked that her eyes widened. She saw that a mercenary behind Mu Yichen had also raised his gun and aimed at him. She instinctively threw herself in front of Xiao Yichen. With a swoosh, an egg pierced her skin. She groaned and furrowed her eyebrows. Mu Yichen heard her painful voice and furrowed his eyebrows. Before he could turn around, he blacked out and knelt on the ground. He wanted to stand up, but Lisa fell into his arms. Lisa, Li. Mu Yichen's gaze froze and he also fell to the ground. In the night, a pair of frightened eyes suddenly opened. Yu sat up from the bed in shock. He instinctively held onto his abdomen where there was still a faint stinging pain. It was so painful as though he had been shot by a bullet. He dreamt that he was imprisoned in a cage and desperately wanted to escape. However, he was surrounded by countless black shadows. Soon after, he felt that he had been shot many times and woke up from his dream. When he woke up, his back was covered in cold sweat. Chapter 3630. What was going on? Why would he have such a dream? Yu held his forehead. His temples were throbbing and his veins were popping as if they were about to explode. What's going on? Yu tapped his temples in pain. When he got up, he heard a clear cry coming from next door. Boo-hoo, boo-hoo. It was Yueyao's voice. Yu got out of bed and opened the door. Yueyao's room was next door. He walked in and turned on the lights. He saw a pair of small hands clutching the crib and her little legs kicking in aggrievedly. He walked to the bedside nervously and saw Yueyao crying so hard that her face was red and her eyelashes were stained with tears. Yu bent down slightly and carried her in his arms, lifting her up gently. Now that he had learned how to carry a child, he could carry Yueyao comfortably. Surprisingly, when he carried Yueyao stopped crying. She widened her eyes curiously. The corners of her eyes were filled with tears. When she blinked her eyes gently, the tears started to flow. However, just as the tears started to flow, Yueyao opened her mouth and revealed 2 snow-white front teeth as she laughed. She laughed so happily that she reached out her little hand that was covered with her saliva and touched his face. Yu frowned and pushed her hand away in disdain. He muttered, "Don't touch my face with your dirty hands." He patted her little hand and Yueyao retracted her hand in pain. She pursed her lips pitifully and looked like she was about to cry. Boo-hoo! She curled her little hand and stared at him innocently. She looked like she wanted to say something. However, she had not learned how to speak yet and could only babble out a few clumsy words. "Brother, hug." Yueyao carefully reached out her chubby little hands and opened them, asking for a hug. "Brother, hug me." Yu was stunned. He looked at Yueyao and then looked at her fingers that were covered in saliva. He frowned. Even though he was disgusted, he still held her wrist and held her little hand. Yueyao tried to scratch his face. Her wet saliva was all over his face. At this moment, Yueyao finally stopped crying. She grinned as she grabbed his face. She couldn't bear to let go of it. Yueyao smiled even more happily. Yu touched her face. Suddenly, he heard Yun Shirshir's voice from behind him. "Why are you awake to wake up?" He turned around and saw Yun Shirshir standing at the door. Her expression was gentle. Yu was a little embarrassed and wanted to put Yao down. However, Yao clung to his clothes like a clingy kitten, unwilling to leave him. Xianxia was a little surprised. She said with some surprise, Yao likes to stick to you so much? She doesn't like to be hugged. Yu was stunned. Oh, is that so? You don't remember. When she was young, she would kick her legs and cry if anyone hugged her for too long. You and I were the only ones who were closest to her. I didn't expect that after you left for more than a year, she would still like to stick to you. When Yu heard this, he didn't know why, but he felt a surge of warmth in his heart. She's hungry. Xianxia walked over and said to him, carry her. I'll warm up the milk for her. Yu didn't say much. He only responded softly, okay. Chapter 36-31. Yu lowered his head and looked at Yao in his arms. His gaze softened. Call me big brother. Yu pinched her fleshy paw. Her soft touch made him feel an inexplicable sense of tenderness. However, she didn't do it when he asked her to. As though she didn't understand what he said, she tilted her head and blinked her clear eyes. She stared at Yu with a confused expression. Didn't you call me big brother, just now? Yu shook her little hand and said, call me big brother again. Yao babbled as she clutched his face. Her gaze suddenly landed on his chest. She opened her mouth wide, revealing her pink and tender gums. Suddenly, she opened her mouth wide and bit down on his shirt. Yu's face turned pale. He told her stiffly, I don't have any milk for you. However, Yao didn't understand him. Her little hands clawed at his shirt and her little mouth bit his shirt. Her saliva stained his shirt. When Xianxia came in, she saw Yu standing helplessly by the crib. Yao was biting his shirt as though she was drinking milk. Yao had been weaned for a long time and had been breastfeeding with powdered milk ever since. Seeing this scene, Xianxia didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She immediately walked over and put the milk bottle aside. She took Yao from Yu's arms and hugged Yao. She coaxed her, are you hungry? As she coaxed her, she reached out to grab the milk bottle. However, Yu had already taken the milk bottle and carefully placed it against Yao's mouth. Yao sucked on the pacifier and smacked it with relish. Sizzle! Yao held the milk bottle with her little hands and drank it with relish. Yu stayed by her side quietly. However, he didn't look at Yao. Instead, he looked at Xianxia in a daze. Many complex emotions flashed across his eyes. However, Xianxia didn't seem to notice that he was staring at her. She said to herself, when you were young, you were much more obedient than your sister. Sometimes, when you were hungry in the middle of the night, you didn't cry. You slept until dawn without waking mommy up. When mommy woke up and ran to the crib in a panic, she saw you holding your fingers and nibbling on them with relish. At that time, I thought that you must have been worried about mommy's tiredness, so you didn't want to wake her. The boy was a little surprised. Were you still working back then? Yes. Until you were weaned. Until you were weaned at that time at. What about Daddy? Just as he blurted out, he realized that he had called him Daddy. His face turned red instantly. He turned his head awkwardly and didn't want to look at her. Xianxia smiled when she heard this. She immediately said, at that time, your daddy wasn't by our side. Did you know? In the past, there was no daddy or brother. There was only you and me. We depended on each other. Although life wasn't as good as it is now, Mommy was really happy with you. As she spoke, she recalled the happy past. Xianxia's eyes suddenly stung. She blinked her eyes and forced her tears away. She retreated and turned to look at Yu. However, he was also staring at her without saying a word. Xianxia took a deep breath and said, don't leave Mommy again, okay? Chapter 36-32. Yu's expression was calm, but his heart was in turmoil. She said, don't leave me again. Why was it that when he heard those words, his heart was so moved? Especially when he heard the words, Yu, he felt his heart burning. Countless chaotic thoughts flooded his mind in an instant. He abruptly rose to his feet and turned around. Just as he was about to leave the room, Yao suddenly let go of the milk bottle and looked at him. She called out in a childish voice, "Big brother." Yu did not stop and walked back to the room. When Mu Yichen woke up, he opened his eyes and saw that his surroundings were bright. He looked around and wanted to move, but he realized that he was tied to a chair and could not move at all. Mu Yichen lowered his head and saw himself sitting on a chair. His hands were cuffed behind his back, and his legs were chained to the back of the chair. His body was also chained to the back of the chair. What was going on? Wasn't he shot? He looked around and finally saw that he was in a dark room. A beam of light shone down from the top of his head, and it was so bright that he could not open his eyes. Xiao Yichen tried his best to open his eyes and forced himself to adapt to the strong light. He looked at Lisa beside him, who was also tied to a chair. Her head was lowered and she was still unconscious. Mu Yichen looked at her back and saw that the wound was not deep. If it was a real bullet, it would not have left such a shallow wound. He carefully recalled that when he was shot, he fainted and was unconscious. Mu Yichen immediately realized that Gong Xiaoying must have ordered him to shoot with a tranquilizer gun. Could it be that they were shot with a tranquilizer gun? Xiao Yichen tried to call out to Lisa. Lisa, you're awake. A heavy voice suddenly interrupted his train of thought. Mu Yichen spun his head around in shock, only to see Gong Xiaoying standing in front of him and judging him from above. When he saw Gong Xiaoying, anger appeared in his eyes. He struggled and shouted, "What did you do to Lisa?" Gong Xiaoying said coldly, "Don't worry, she's not dead." When Mu Yichen heard that, he asked suspiciously, "You used a tranquilizer gun? You even know about tranquilizer guns. You're not simple." Gong Xiaoying pulled a chair over and sat down. He sighed and said, "My two grandsons, one is good at martial arts, one is smart, and the other is good at martial arts. It's really an eye-opener." "Grandsons?" Mu Yichen mocked, "I didn't acknowledge you as my grandfather." "This lord, you'd better not be so sentimental. I'll never acknowledge you as my grandpa." Gong Xiaoying did not exchange pleasantries and went straight to the point. "Where's Gong Fan?" Mu Yichen retorted, "Do you think I'll tell you? Besides, you're asking the wrong person. I don't know any Gong Fan. I don't need you to tell me. Since you've swapped identities, Gong Fan must be in the Mu family now." Mu Yichen snorted coldly, but he was a little flustered. Gong Xiaoying looked at him calmly. When he saw that he did not look at him, he said helplessly, "You're my grandson and I'm your grandfather. No matter how you deny it, it's a fact that can't be changed. You don't have to be so cold to me. It won't do you any good."